My husband packed my suitcase for our trip to Dubai, slipping a black velvet pouch inside to ensure I would be locked away in a foreign prison forever. So I took that pouch and quietly transferred it into the luggage of his secretary instead. At the airport security checkpoint, when the agents opened her bag, he completely lost his mind and confessed to his own crime on the spot. I am Maya, 34 years old, a forensic accountant who spent the last 5 years being belittled by the man who was supposed to love me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic partner who drastically underestimated your intelligence. The bright lights of John F. Kennedy Airport buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare over the crowded checkpoint. It was a chaotic Tuesday morning filled with rushed travelers and anxious tourists. I stood in the expedited security lane holding my travel bag with a perfectly steady hand. Just 2 steps ahead of me stood my husband Julian. He was 35 years old, the chief financial officer of a major tech firm, and a man who believed he was perpetually the smartest person in any room. Right beside him was Vanessa, his young secretary, who coincidentally booked the same flight to Dubai for a supposed corporate summit. Vanessa flipped her hair, adjusting her designer sunglasses, while giving me a condescending smirk that she barely bothered to hide. Julian turned back to look at me. His handsome face was arranged into an expression of feigned concern, but his eyes danced with a malicious, barely contained excitement. The alarm on the screening machine suddenly blared a piercing, loud shriek that brought the bustling terminal to an abrupt halt. 3 Transportation Security Administration agents immediately stepped forward, their faces set in grim lines of authority. They demanded that the luggage owner step aside for a manual inspection. Julian leaned in close to my ear, his breath hot against my cheek. "Do not worry, honey," he whispered, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "I will hire a really good lawyer for you." He fully expected the agents to tear into my neatly packed suitcase. He was waiting for the moment they would uncover the black velvet pouch he had secretly planted between my silk blouses late last night. He had meticulously calculated this exact scenario, envisioning me being dragged away in handcuffs, screaming my innocence while he played the devastated, helpless husband. His plan was flawless in his own mind. He would fly off to Dubai, drain millions from his company, and start a new life with Vanessa, leaving me to face international drug trafficking charges. But the agents completely bypassed my luggage. Instead, they surrounded Vanessa. They aggressively unzipped her expensive leather travel bag, pulling her meticulously folded clothes apart. Julian frowned, taking a confused step forward, as the head agent reached into the bottom compartment of the bag belonging to Vanessa. His confident smirk melted into a mask of pure confusion when the agent pulled out a heavy black velvet pouch. The agent unfastened the drawstrings and emptied the contents onto the stainless steel inspection table. 2 solid, wrapped bricks of cocaine thudded heavily against the metal, followed by a sleek silver encrypted hard drive. The entire security line gasped in unison. Vanessa let out a horrified shriek, stepping backward until she hit the conveyor belt. Julian stood absolutely paralyzed, his eyes bulging out of his skull as he stared at the contraband. The sheer impossibility of the situation shattered his carefully constructed reality. Unable to process the failure of his foolproof scheme, Julian completely lost his mind. "That is impossible," he screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he pointed a shaking finger at the table. "That was supposed to be in the bag of my wife. I put it in the bag of my wife." A stunned silence fell over the checkpoint. The agents instantly unclipped their radios and drew their weapons, their training kicking in as they shouted commands for everyone to get on the ground. Julian had just handed them a full, uncoerced confession in front of dozens of witnesses. I looked at Julian, letting a slow, freezing smile spread across my face. "You mean the bag you so generously packed for me last night?" I asked, my voice cutting cleanly through the chaotic shouting of the agents. "Because you wanted to be a helpful husband after belittling my forensic accounting career for 5 consecutive years." You really thought a professional fraud investigator would not notice you tampering with her luggage. Vanessa was violently slammed against the wall by two officers. Cold metal handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists as she sobbed hysterically. She thrashed against the agent, screaming vile curses at Julian for dragging her into this mess. Realizing his life was imploding, Julian let out a feral roar. He lunged at me, his hands reaching for my throat, ready to tear me apart. He never even made it 2 steps before a large police officer tackled him hard to the linoleum floor. I stood perfectly still, watching my husband writhe on the ground as his hands were wrenched behind him, the satisfying click of the handcuffs echoing in my ears. Just as the officers hauled Julian to his feet, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my pocket. I calmly pulled it out and answered. It was Patricia, his elitist, manipulative mother. Her frantic, shrill voice blasted through the speaker. "What did you do to my son?" she screamed, her words dripping with pure venom. "You fix this right now, you ungrateful wretch!" I simply ended the call, slid the phone back into my pocket, and turned my back on the wreckage of my marriage. The journey ahead would be difficult, but I was fully prepared to finally watch him lose everything he ever valued. Exactly 24 hours earlier, the atmosphere in our formal dining room was thick with the smell of roasted lamb and hypocrisy. Julian stood at the head of the long mahogany table, raising a crystal glass of expensive champagne. To new horizons and massive corporate expansions, he declared, his voice booming. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, watching him play his role to perfection. Beside him sat his secretary Vanessa, attending our intimate family dinner as an honored guest. She wore a crimson cocktail dress and a smug expression directed solely at me. Julian looked down at me and chuckled condescendingly. And to my lovely wife Maya. While I am out there closing multi-million-dollar deals, she will be safely tucked away in her cubicle playing with spreadsheets. Forensic accounting is noble work, honey, even if it is just boring penny pinching. Someone has to keep the calculators warm. David, my brother-in-law, laughed loudly at Julian's joke, slapping the table. Beside him sat his wife Zoe. She was quiet, observant, and fiercely intelligent. Zoe was the only person in this room who actually worked for a living, and the only reason I tolerated these gatherings. She caught my eye and subtly shook her head in a gesture of solidarity. Patricia, my mother-in-law, sat directly across from me. She wiped her mouth and reached into her designer handbag, pulling out a sleek velvet box and sliding it across the table toward Vanessa. "Vanessa, darling," Patricia purred. "You have been working so incredibly hard for Julian. An executive making real moves needs a woman by his side who looks like $1,000,000. Not someone who sits behind a desk all day in sweatpants analyzing tax codes." Vanessa opened the box with a theatrical gasp. Inside rested a diamond tennis necklace easily worth $10,000. "Oh, Patricia, it is absolutely stunning," Vanessa squealed, leaning over to kiss her cheek. Julian smiled approvingly. "I recognized that necklace immediately. The charge had appeared on my shared credit card statement 3 days ago. They were buying each other diamonds using my credit line and mocking my wardrobe in my own dining room." Zoe slammed her heavy wine glass down onto the wooden table with a sharp crack that silenced the room. "You have a lot of nerve," Patricia Zoe stated, her voice completely devoid of polite deference. "Maya paid off the mortgage on the house you are sitting in right now. She funded the very trust account David uses to buy his cars. You are all living on her dime while you sit here insulting her." Patricia turned her nose up her face, twisting into an ugly sneer. "I will not be lectured about finances by someone from your background, Zoe. We all know you only married David to escape that rundown neighborhood you grew up in. Do not forget your place at this table." David looked down at his plate, completely unwilling to defend his own wife. Zoe narrowed her eyes, preparing to tear Patricia apart verbally. I reached under the table and gripped her hand firmly. I squeezed her fingers, pressing my foot gently against hers. I leaned over, pretending to pick up my dropped napkin, and whispered directly into her ear. "Let them dig their own graves, Zoe. The deeper the hole, the harder it is to climb out." Zoe caught my gaze, recognizing the cold calculation in my eyes. She slowly relaxed her shoulders, offering a tight nod. Later that night, the house was silent. Julian was passed out in our bed, breathing heavily. I slipped out from under the covers barefoot and walked into his home office. He thought a complex password could hide his secrets from the woman who literally cracked corporate fraud rings for a living. He was profoundly mistaken. It took me less than 12 minutes to bypass his two-factor authentication, routing his login request through a mirrored server I had set up weeks ago. I opened his primary drive and navigated straight to a hidden partition masked as system cache files. Julian had systematically drained $5 million from his own company, routing the funds through a maze of offshore shell corporations. He had registered these shell companies using my name, my social security number, and my professional credentials, setting me up as the ultimate scapegoat. I found a folder containing heavily encrypted communications with a dark web fixer. Julian had purchased 2 kilos of pure cocaine and a stolen encrypted hard drive containing classified corporate trade secrets. I read through the finalized plan. He planned to plant the drugs and the stolen data in my checked luggage. I would be arrested by federal agents at the airport, facing charges of international drug smuggling and corporate espionage. I would rot in a federal prison for decades while he fled to Dubai with my stolen identity, the embezzled millions, and his loyal secretary. I calmly closed the laptop, wiping my digital footprint clean. I walked back into our bedroom and moved to his open suitcase resting on the velvet bench. I slid my hand beneath his folded shirts and felt the distinct shape of a heavy black velvet pouch. I pulled it out, gripping the contraband that was meant to end my life. I walked down the hall to the guest room where Vanessa had left her carry-on bag. I unzipped the front compartment, pushing aside her luxury cosmetics. I carefully tucked the black velvet pouch deep into the lining, zipping it shut with a smooth motion. I also reached into my pocket and pulled out a tiny magnetic GPS tracking device, slipping it straight into the breast pocket of Julian's suit jacket. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception. They just had no idea they were playing against the house. My name is Maya, 34 years old, and I am a forensic accountant who just watched her husband walk straight into a federal trap of his own making. The stark fluorescent lights of the airport precinct interrogation room snapped my focus back to the current reality. The chaotic symphony of the airport security checkpoint had been replaced by the dull hum of an air conditioning unit and the scratching of a detective writing on his notepad. I sat in a rigid metal chair, sipping a cup of bitter, lukewarm coffee. I had just finished giving my preliminary statement, explaining with professional detachment how I was completely unaware of the contraband found in the luggage of my husband and his secretary. The detective seemed skeptical, but my pristine record and calm demeanor offered him no leverage. Before he could ask another question, the heavy metal door of the interrogation room flew open and crashed violently against the concrete wall. Patricia stormed into the room like a hurricane of misplaced entitlement. She wore a tailored cashmere suit and clutched her designer handbag as if it were a weapon. Right behind her hovered David. Julian's younger brother was a 32-year-old man who still expected his mother to solve every minor inconvenience in his life. David looked panicked, sweating through his expensive golf polo, while Patricia radiated pure, unadulterated fury. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not ask what had happened. She marched directly up to my chair, raised her manicured hand, and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp, stinging crack echoed off the cinder-block walls. The detective immediately shot up from his seat, shouting a warning and reaching for his radio. I raised my hand and waved the detective off. I slowly turned my head back to face Patricia, tasting the faint, metallic tang of blood on my lower lip. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I just stared at her with the cold, analytical precision I reserved for auditing fraudulent bank ledgers. "What did you do to my son?" Patricia screamed, her face contorted with rage. "You fix this right now, you ungrateful wretch." "The bail magistrate just set his bond at $1 million. You need to wire the money immediately. Liquidate your little accounting firm or empty your personal savings. I do not care how you do it, but you are going to get Julian out of that holding cell today. David stepped forward, wringing his hands anxiously. Come on, Maya, you have to do this. My friends at the country club are already texting me about the arrest. The rumors are completely out of control. If Julian stays in jail overnight, our family reputation is ruined. You are his wife. It is your duty to handle this financial mess so we can get back to normal. I reached up and casually wiped the small drop of blood from my lip. A slow, chilling laugh escaped my throat. The sound was so entirely devoid of warmth that David actually took a physical step backward. You want me to use my personal savings to bail out your golden boy? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You mean the savings Julian already drained last month to buy Vanessa a luxury penthouse in Manhattan? He forged my signature on a wire transfer to secure the down payment for his mistress, so my accounts are a bit tied up at the moment. Patricia scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. Stop making up ridiculous lies to avoid your responsibilities, Maya. Julian would never do such a thing. He is a brilliant financial officer. You are just being a hysterical, jealous woman. If you refuse to use your money, then I will simply use my own. I will call my wealth manager right now and post the bond myself. I leaned back in the metal chair and smiled. That is a wonderful idea, Patricia. You should absolutely call your wealth manager, or better yet, you should log into your retirement portal. Perhaps you can use the massive trust fund your late husband left you. Oh, wait. You cannot do that either, can you? Patricia froze, her hand hovering over her purse. What are you talking about? She demanded. I kept my eyes locked directly on hers. I am talking about the fact that Julian forged your signature on a power of attorney document 6 months ago. He liquidated your entire retirement portfolio and gambled every single penny on unregulated cryptocurrency shell companies trying to cover his massive corporate embezzlement tracks. He lost it all, Patricia. You are completely broke. You do not have $1 million for bail. You do not even have enough money to pay the property taxes on your estate next month. The color instantly drained from Patricia's face. She turned an ashen, sickly shade of gray. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to grab the edge of the metal table to keep from collapsing. She looked at David, her eyes wide with absolute horror, but David was too busy staring at me in sheer panic, realizing his own financial safety net had just evaporated. Before Patricia could formulate a response, the interrogation room door opened again. A man in a sharp, bespoke suit strutted into the room carrying a sleek leather briefcase. It was Julian's high-powered corporate defense attorney. He possessed the kind of sleazy, arrogant demeanor that only came from years of bullying people into submission. He barely glanced at me before turning to Patricia and David. I need you both to step out into the hallway, he commanded smoothly. I need to provide some marital legal counsel to my client's wife. Patricia was too stunned by my financial revelation to argue. David practically had to drag her out of the room by her elbow, the heavy door clicking shut behind them. The lawyer turned to the detective and requested a moment of privacy, citing attorney-client privilege. The detective hesitated, but eventually stepped out, leaving me entirely alone with the man hired to destroy my life. The lawyer approached the table and clicked his briefcase open. He pulled out a thick stack of stapled legal documents and slid them across the metal surface toward me. He then retrieved an expensive silver pen from his breast pocket and laid it deliberately on top of the paper. Let us be pragmatic about this, Maya, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Julian is a vital corporate asset. He is a beloved executive with a bright future. You are just a mid-level accountant. The media narrative is already being spun by our public relations team. If you fight this, you will be crushed by the federal government and left with absolutely nothing. He tapped the silver pen against the document. However, Julian is a generous man. He is willing to offer you a lifeline. Sign this drafted confession. You take the full fall for planting the drugs and orchestrating the theft of the encrypted hard drive. You admit you acted alone out of spite. In exchange, Julian will mercifully allow you to keep the marital home, and he will not sue you for defamation. It is the best deal you are ever going to get. I looked down at the neatly typed confession. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction designed to bury me alive. I slowly reached out and picked up the silver pen. I rolled the cool metal between my fingers, examining it carefully. The lawyer smiled, a greasy, victorious smirk spreading across his face as he assumed I was breaking under the pressure. I looked past him, staring directly into the two-way mirror on the wall, fully aware that Julian might be watching from the adjacent room. "You really want me to sign away my freedom for a house I already own?" I asked, my voice echoing in the quiet room. I flipped the silver pen in my hand, gripping it like a dagger. Instead of signing my name on the dotted line, I drove my fist downward with all my strength. The metal tip of the pen stabbed directly through the thick stack of legal documents, piercing the paper and embedding itself a full inch deep into the solid wooden table. The lawyer jumped back in shock, his smug expression shattering instantly. I stood up from my chair, leaning over the pinned document. "Go tell Julian he needs a better strategy because this accountant just rejected his settlement." The corporate lawyer stared at the silver pen vibrating in the solid oak table. His mouth hung slightly open, his expensive veneer completely shattered by my refusal. He grabbed the pen and yanked it out of the wood, his face flushing a violent shade of crimson. "You are making a catastrophic mistake, Maya," he snarled, his voice echoing in the small interrogation room. "You think you are being clever, but Julian is always 10 steps ahead of you. He already played his trump card while you were busy playing the victim." I crossed my arms and waited for the punchline. The moment my client was placed in handcuffs, he enacted an emergency marital asset freeze, the lawyer declared with a triumphant sneer. As your husband and the primary earner, he had the legal right to halt all transactions on your joint accounts, your business accounts, and your personal savings. He reported suspicious activity to the banking authorities. You have absolutely zero access to capital. You cannot hire a defense attorney. You cannot post your own bail if the district attorney decides to charge you as a co-conspirator. You are entirely financially paralyzed. You have nothing. The heavy metal door swung open again. Patricia and David pushed their way back into the room, having clearly been eavesdropping from the hallway. Patricia wore a vicious, satisfied smile. Her sharp designer heels clicked loudly and aggressively against the scuffed linoleum floor as she approached the metal table, stopping just inches from my face. She smelled of expensive perfume and cheap desperation. "You really thought you could outsmart my son?" Patricia spat, leaning over the table to glare at me. "You are nothing without him. You are just a glorified bookkeeper who got lucky enough to marry into a prominent family. Now you are going to be begging on the streets. Sign the confession, Maya. Take the blame for the drugs. It is the only way you walk away from this with a roof over your head." David stood behind his mother, nodding vigorously. "Come on, Maya, just do it. Think about the greater good. Julian is the primary breadwinner and the golden boy. The company needs him. You can just do a few years in a minimum security facility. It will not be that bad. We will even put some money in your commissary account." I looked at my spineless brother-in-law, then at my venomous mother-in-law, and finally at the sleazy corporate lawyer. I did not scream. I did not cry. I reached down to the floor and picked up my leather tote bag. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out my silver laptop, placing it gently on the table where the confession document used to be. "What are you doing?" the lawyer asked, laughing mockingly. "Are you going to log into your bank portal and cry at your zero balances?" I flipped the screen open. My fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced lethal precision, striking the keys with a rhythmic clatter. I did not log into a standard consumer banking portal. I opened a highly secure encrypted gateway. A prominent Federal Eagle logo flashed on the screen as my credentials authenticated. "You are operating under a severely outdated set of facts," I said, my eyes fixed on the glowing monitor. "A week ago, I initiated a legal separation of all our marital assets. It was quietly processed through a private judge under a sealed corporate dissolving order. I hold no joint accounts with Julian. My personal savings and my firm's operational capital are locked in a secure independent trust that your client cannot touch." I turned the laptop screen around so the lawyer could see the raw data. Furthermore, I continued, my voice deadly calm, I did not just separate my money. I utilized my federal clearance as a certified forensic auditor. I flagged Julian's primary offshore holding accounts, his domestic corporate accounts, and your family trust for severe suspicious activity. I submitted a 40-page dossier detailing massive money laundering operations directly to the federal authorities. The lawyer leaned in, squinting at the screen. The color drained from his face as he read the transaction statuses. Julian did not freeze my accounts, I stated flatly. I froze his. Because my fraud alerts carry immediate federal weight, every single penny to his name is currently locked in a federal holding pattern. He cannot pay your retainer. He cannot pay his massive bail. He is completely bankrupt until the government finishes a comprehensive investigation, which will take years. David let out a loud, choked gasp. He grabbed the back of Patricia's chair, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "Wait," he stammered, his voice rising in panic. "What did you just say about the family trust? Maya, what did you do to the trust?" I looked at David with absolute indifference. "Your lavish lifestyle is entirely funded by Julian's corporate shell companies, David. The same shell companies he used to launder stolen money. Therefore, your trust fund is considered the fruit of a poisoned tree. It is frozen." Patricia let out a sharp, breathless shriek. She desperately dug into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone. Her hands were shaking so violently she dropped it twice before managing to dial her private banker. She pressed the phone to her ear, demanding answers. We could hear the faint voice of the banker on the other end, explaining that her portfolios were locked under a federal mandate. Patricia dropped the phone in sheer disbelief. The expensive device hit the ground and shattered against the hard floor, the screen spiderwebbing into 100 broken pieces. "My accounts," she whispered, her voice hollow and terrified. "My accounts are locked. My credit cards are declined. I have nothing." David spun around and grabbed his mother by the shoulders. "You told me my money was safe," he screamed, his face contorted with panic. "You told me Julian had everything handled. I have a mortgage due on the vacation house next week. What am I supposed to do?" The perfect elite family was instantly turning on each other completely, cannibalizing their own relationships the second the money disappeared. The lawyer hastily packed his briefcase, his hands trembling as he realized he was not getting paid for this morning's work. Before the lawyer could escape, the interrogation room door opened one more time. A tired-looking public defender holding a battered manila folder walked into the chaotic room. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at me, ignoring the shouting family members. "I represent Vanessa, the public defender," announced his voice cutting through the noise. "My client is absolutely terrified. She is sitting in a holding cell facing decades in a federal penitentiary. She is ready to cut a plea deal with the district attorney right now. She is willing to testify that Julian orchestrated the entire drug smuggling operation. She will tell them he packed the cocaine." Patricia stopped crying and looked up, a glimmer of desperate hope flashing in her eyes. "The secretary is taking the fall." Patricia breathed heavily. "There is a condition," the public defender added, holding up a single finger. "Vanessa claims she knows absolutely nothing about the stolen corporate hard drive. She insists Maya orchestrated the corporate espionage and planted the hard drive in her bag. Vanessa will only testify against Julian for the drugs if Maya agrees to take the full fall for the corporate theft." The room went dead silent. Everyone stared at me, waiting to see if I would accept this new treacherous bargain. I slowly closed my laptop, securing the metal clasp. I looked at the public defender and allowed a sharp, predatory smile to curve my lips. "Bring her in," I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms over my chest. "Let us have a little talk." The public defender gave a brisk nod and slipped out the heavy metal door. I sat back in the rigid chair, relishing the quiet hum of the precinct air conditioning. The detective returned, leaning against the concrete wall with his arms crossed, clearly eager to see how this forensic accountant was about to dismantle a federal drug smuggling ring from a folding table. 2 minutes later, the door swung open. A uniformed officer escorted Vanessa into the room. The crimson cocktail dress she had worn to our family dinner the night before was now wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. Heavy steel handcuffs bound her wrists, but her posture remained aggressively defiant. She dropped into the chair across from me, the metal scraping loudly against the linoleum. She threw her hair over her shoulder and leveled a venomous sneer in my direction. "You really think you have won, Maya?" She spat, her voice dripping with unearned confidence. You think freezing a few bank accounts makes you powerful? Julian is going to absolutely crush you. He loves me. He is probably arranging my release right this very second. Once he gets out of here, we are going to ruin your reputation. I am going to tell the federal prosecutors that you orchestrated this entire corporate espionage scheme out of bitter jealousy. You are going to be the one rotting in a cell while Julian and I spend your money in Dubai. I let her finish her little speech. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick red dossier I had compiled during my midnight raid of Julian's encrypted hard drive. I dropped it onto the metal table with a heavy thud and slid it directly across to her handcuffed hands. "Open it," I instructed calmly. Vanessa scoffed, rolling her eyes, but her public defender leaned over and flipped the cover open for her. I watched her eyes dart across the top page. "You are remarkably naive, Vanessa," I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the table. "You think Julian is a mastermind protecting his beloved partner." Turn to page 3. Look at the incorporation documents for the offshore shell companies holding the embezzled funds. Notice the primary guarantor's signature. Notice the Social Security number attached to the federal tax identification form. It is not my Social Security number, Vanessa. It is yours. Vanessa stopped breathing. Her eyes widened as she stared at the highlighted digits on the page. She shook her head in denial. "No," she whispered. "He told me those papers were just routine non-disclosure agreements for the executive team." "He lied," I replied smoothly. "He registered every single fraudulent entity in your name. If the feds caught on, you were legally designated as the sole proprietor of a massive international money laundering operation. But it gets better. Have your lawyer turn to page 7. The public defender flipped the page. Vanessa leaned in her face, turning ash white. "You thought the Manhattan penthouse he bought last month was a testament to his exclusive love for you?" I asked, my tone dropping to a freezing register. "Look at the wire transfers underneath it. He bought a luxury condo in Miami for a woman named Chloe. 2 weeks later, he wired a down payment for a townhouse in Aspen for a woman named Sarah. He also has a standing lease on a flat in London for someone named Elena. He didn't love you, Vanessa. He made you his ultimate liability shield. You're looking at 25 years for drug trafficking and fraud." A choked sob escaped her throat. The arrogant facade shattered completely, leaving behind a terrified, manipulated woman who had just realized she was standing on the gallows. Between the shell companies registered in her name and the 2 kilos of cocaine pulled directly from her personal luggage, she was holding the bag for a multi-million-dollar international crime syndicate. Vanessa broke. The remaining color vanished from her face, and she slumped forward, resting her forehead against the cold metal table. She began sobbing uncontrollably, her heavy handcuffs clinking as she shook. She looked up at her public defender, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. "What do I do?" she gasped. "Please tell me what to do." The public defender looked at me, recognizing who held the real power in the room. He turned to his client. "You tell her everything, Vanessa. You give her whatever she needs to secure a federal immunity deal." Vanessa looked at me, her eyes pleading. "I have a physical ledger," she confessed, her voice trembling. Julian did not trust cloud servers for the real numbers. He kept a handwritten, encrypted ledger of every single illicit transaction, every bribe, and every offshore account. He locked it in a private safety deposit box at a bank downtown. "I am the only one who has the key. I will give it to you, Maya. I will testify to whatever you want. Just please do not let them send me to federal prison." I smiled a genuine, victorious smile. The physical ledger was the ultimate kill shot. It was the undeniable proof that would not only lock Julian away forever, but also dismantle his entire corrupt executive board. Just as the public defender pulled out a notepad to formalize Vanessa's cooperation agreement, the heavy interrogation room door swung open with a violent metallic crash. The sleazy corporate defense attorney strutted back into the room, a triumphant sneer replacing his previous panic. Stepping through the doorway, right behind him, adjusting the lapels of his expensive tailored suit, was Julian. He was no longer wearing handcuffs. His posture was rigid with unadulterated malice. The detective stepped forward in shock. How is he out of holding the bail magistrate set bond at $1 million cash? His wife froze all his accounts. The corporate lawyer chuckled, adjusting his tie. His personal accounts are indeed locked. However, my client is a senior executive. I bypassed the personal asset freeze by enacting an emergency corporate bailout clause. The board of directors authorized a direct transfer from the company's unfreezable operational emergency fund. The bond has been posted in full. My client is a free man. Vanessa shrank back in her chair, terrified of the man she had just agreed to betray. Julian ignored her entirely. His cold, furious eyes locked onto mine, burning with a terrifying intensity. He took a slow, menacing step toward the table, placing his hands flat against the metal surface and leaning in close. "You're dead in this city," Julian hissed, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. "I'm calling an emergency board meeting to destroy you." Julian's hollow threat bounced off the concrete walls of the precinct. I did not blink or offer him a single syllable of a response. I simply picked up my leather tote bag, adjusted the strap on my shoulder, and walked right past his custom-tailored suit. He could call 100 emergency board meetings. It would not change the undeniable fact that his signature was on the money-laundering shell companies and his drugs were in the hands of federal agents. I stepped out of the police station into the cool evening air, hailed a private car, and gave the driver my home address. I needed to pack a few essential bags, retrieve a hidden lockbox of secondary hard drives, and relocate to a secure hotel before the federal indictments officially dropped in the morning. As my driver turned onto the private tree-lined cul-de-sac, my phone buzzed with an automated security alert from my home network. I looked out the window and let out a long, exasperated breath. 6 luxury vehicles were parked haphazardly across my manicured front lawn and circular driveway. I immediately recognized Patricia's silver sedan and David's obnoxious red sports car. Beside them sat several other high-end SUVs belonging to Julian's extended family. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who had deliberately ignored my existence for an entire decade were now clustered together on my manicured front lawn like a flock of well-dressed vultures. I paid the driver, stepped out of the vehicle, and walked purposefully up the bluestone path. The hushed whispers of the crowd ceased instantly as I approached. Patricia stood at the top of the grand porch stairs, physically blocking the massive mahogany double doors. She was flanked by David and Julian's Aunt Beatrice, a woman who wore a perpetual scowl and enough diamonds to fund a small nation. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a formidable wall of generational wealth and utterly unearned entitlement. "We have been waiting for you, Maya," Patricia announced, her voice carrying a shrill, authoritarian tone that demanded immediate compliance. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs, crossing my arms. "Are you hosting a neighborhood block party, Patricia?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "Because I do not remember sending out invitations." Aunt Beatrice stepped forward, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Do not use that insolent tone with us, you destructive little girl. We know exactly what you did. Julian called us the second he was released. We know you suffered a complete mental breakdown and tried to frame him to cover up your own pathetic corporate espionage scheme." I stared at the crowd of angry elite faces, realizing exactly what this was. This was a staged intervention. Julian had mobilized his entire family, using his meticulously crafted victim narrative to turn his relatives into an angry mob. They were here to bully me into submission. "You are going to fix this," Maya, David yelled from the top step, his face flushed with panic. "My friends at the country club are already asking questions. The family name is being dragged through the mud. You need to call the district attorney right now and issue a full public apology. Tell them Julian is innocent. Tell them you planted those drugs because you were jealous of Vanessa. It is the only honorable thing left for you to do," Patricia added, placing her hands on her hips. "You take the blame and quietly fade away. In exchange, we will not press civil charges against you for defaming our family legacy. We will allow you to pack a single suitcase of your cheap clothes before you leave." I looked at Patricia, tilting my head slightly. "Before I leave," I repeated. "Yes, before you leave," Patricia snapped, stepping down one stair to look down at me. "Leave your house keys, your security fobs, and the garage remotes on the porch railing. You are officially evicted." This estate is legally owned by the extended family trust. It was purchased to house the future heirs of this lineage. You have absolutely no legal right to stand on this property another second. Get off my porch, you ungrateful criminal. I did not yell. I did not argue. I calmly unzipped my leather tote bag and reached into the interior waterproof pocket. I pulled out a thick, legally bound document stamped with the official seal of the county registrar. I unfolded the heavy parchment and held it up, allowing the porch lights to illuminate the bold printed text. You clearly do not review your own trust ledgers, Patricia, I said, my voice slicing through the crisp night air with absolute lethal precision. I bought out the family trust 3 years ago. The entire front yard fell dead silent. Patricia froze, her smug expression collapsing into a mask of sheer confusion. What are you talking about? She stammered. 3 years ago, Julian nearly bankrupted your precious family trust with a series of disastrous commercial real estate investments, I explained, taking a slow, deliberate step up the stairs. The bank was 72 hours away from foreclosing on this very house. Julian begged me to save his reputation, so I used the profits from my forensic consulting firm to pay off the massive deficit. I legally purchased the deed directly from the trust. I am the sole registered owner of this property. I took another step up the stairs, closing the distance between us. You are not evicting me, Patricia. You are trespassing on my porch. Now take your ridiculous family intervention and get off my property before I call the police and have you all arrested for breaking and entering. Patricia's eyes bulged with pure, unfiltered rage. The realization that she had absolutely no power over me, that her pristine family legacy was a hollow, bankrupt lie, shattered her remaining sanity. With a feral scream, she lunged at me. Her hands formed into claws, aiming directly for my face, desperate to rip the deed from my hands and tear me apart. I braced myself for the impact, but she never reached me. Tires screeched violently against the asphalt. A massive black tactical SUV jumped the curb and slammed to a halt directly at the base of the porch stairs. The heavy passenger door flew open and Zoe stepped out. David's wife moved with terrifying military-grade precision. In one fluid motion, she vaulted up the stairs, intercepted Patricia's lunging body, and effortlessly pinned the older woman's arms behind her back, holding her in a strict submission hold. Patricia shrieked, thrashing wildly against the grip, but Zoe held her completely immobilized. David squeaked and scrambled backward, terrified of his own wife. Zoe did not even look at the struggling woman she had pinned. She looked directly over Patricia's shoulder, locking eyes with me. Her expression was fiercely determined. "It is time," Zoe said, her voice calm and absolute. "Let us burn it all down." Zoe shoved Patricia forward. The older woman stumbled wildly on her designer heels, crashing directly into David's chest with a sharp gasp. Before anyone else in the mob could react, Zoe grabbed my arm and pulled me backward. We stepped across the threshold and slammed the heavy mahogany double doors, shutting out the chorus of outraged screams. I threw the deadbolt and engaged the reinforced steel security locks. The muffled sounds of Patricia beating her fists against the solid wood echoed through the grand foyer, but the fortified doors did not even rattle. Zoe did not flinch at the noise. She rolled her shoulders, shook out her wrists, and dropped the timid, submissive posture she had maintained for the last 4 years. The transformation was instantaneous and deeply chilling. She reached into her dark jacket and produced a matte black encrypted communication device, something far beyond commercial-grade technology. "Are the perimeter cameras secure?" Zoe asked. Her voice clipped and professional, completely devoid of the soft hesitation she always used around my spineless brother-in-law. I pulled out my phone and activated the localized security sweep. Audio and visual feeds are isolated and running on an independent encrypted server, I confirmed. They are entirely locked out. Zoe gave a brisk nod. Good. The director wants an update before midnight. Watching Zoe operate was an absolute thrill, even after 12 months of secret collaboration. To my arrogant husband, to Patricia, and to the rest of the elitist family, Zoe was just David's quiet, underwhelming wife. They viewed her as a charity case, a woman from a working-class immigrant background who should be eternally grateful merely to sit at their polished dining table. They constantly mocked her cheap clothes and her lack of a pedigree. They had absolutely no idea they were breaking bread with a special agent for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I led the way down the hall to my private home office. I pulled the heavy blackout curtains shut while Zoe immediately began running a localized bug sweep of the room using a small handheld scanner. We had spent the last year meticulously weaving a net around Julian's empire. My forensic accounting provided the raw financial discrepancies, and Zoe possessed the federal authority to trace those discrepancies through international banking channels that I could not legally access. Clear, Zoe announced, tossing the scanner onto my desk. She dropped into a leather armchair and let out a sharp laugh. I have to admit, watching Patricia's face when you pulled out that property deed was the highlight of my entire year. I opened my laptop and connected the red dossier drive. I am honestly surprised she did not suffer a spontaneous aneurysm right there on the porch, I replied, typing in my passwords. But we need to move fast. Julian just used corporate emergency funds to post his bail. He is out and he is already mobilizing the board of directors. Zoe leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Let him mobilize them. It will just add more co-conspirators to our federal indictment. His arrogance is a terminal disease, Maya. He truly believes he is untouchable. He thinks he is the smartest man in every room, I said, verifying the data packet transfers. Zoe scoffed, pulling up a secure portal on her federal device. That exact arrogance is what gave me everything I needed. Patricia and Julian spent 4 years treating me like an uneducated servant. Do you know how incredibly sloppy wealthy criminals get when they think the person sitting next to them is too stupid to understand what they are saying? I stopped typing and looked at her. It was brutal watching Patricia insult you at every single family dinner. You took so much abuse to make this case work. Zoe waved a hand dismissively, her expression hardening into a predatory smile. I let her make her racist remarks. I let her critique my heritage, my family, and my lack of a trust fund. Because every time she launched into one of her cruel monologues about why her bloodline was superior, everyone at the table focused entirely on her. Nobody ever looked at my hands. Zoe reached into her pocket and pulled out a tiny silver flash drive no larger than a fingernail, tossing it onto the desk. While Patricia was busy explaining why my culture was inferior, I was slipping under the dining table and attaching audio transmitters to the underside of Julian's custom oak chairs. Zoe explained, her voice practically humming with satisfaction. While David and Julian were laughing at my expense in the living room, I was excusing myself to use the restroom and sliding data extraction clones into the primary router in Julian's home office. They invited a federal agent into their inner sanctum because they were too blinded by their own bigotry to see me as a threat. I shook my head in absolute awe. You literally downloaded his entire offshore routing history between the salad course and dessert. Zoe nodded sharply. Exactly. And the IRS now has direct confirmation of every single shell company he registered under Vanessa's social security number. We have the wire transfers to the properties in Miami, Aspen, and London. The moment we secure that physical handwritten ledger, Vanessa promised you, we have a bulletproof RICO case. We can freeze the entire corporate entity, dismantle the board of directors, and seize every personal asset attached to the family name. We were hours away from total victory. We just needed to secure Vanessa's physical ledger before Julian realized she had flipped. Suddenly, a harsh buzzing sound shattered the quiet focus of the room. Zoe looked down at her secure federal device. The screen flashed bright red, indicating a Priority 1 alert from her division director. I watched the blood slowly drain from Zoe's face. The triumphant energy evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, rigid tension. She read the message twice, her jaw clenching so hard a muscle feathered in her cheek. What is it? I asked, stepping away from my desk. What is wrong? Zoe looked up, her dark eyes wide with shock. Julian did not just mobilize his board, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He went completely scorched earth. What did he do? I demanded, feeling a sudden chill in my veins. He initiated a hostile corporate override. Zoe read directly from the glowing screen. His board of directors just held an emergency vote. They officially suspended your forensic accounting firm from all current and past contracts, citing gross negligence and malicious corporate sabotage. He cannot do that, I fired back. My firm operates independently. He just did, Zoe replied, her grip tightening on the device. But that is not the worst part, Maya. Julian completely flipped the narrative. He utilized his political connections within the district attorney's office. He is claiming you and Vanessa conspired to embezzle the funds and that you framed him when the audit got too close to your own accounts. I felt the floor drop beneath me. He is blaming me for the money laundering. Zoe stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. It is worse. Julian scheduled a press conference for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning on the steps of the federal courthouse. He and the board are going to publicly announce that they are pressing federal corporate espionage and racketeering charges against you. He has a manufactured paper trail ready to hand to the press. The room fell dead silent. Julian was not just fighting back. He was trying to completely annihilate me before the sun came up. I looked at the glowing screen of my laptop, then at Zoe. The trap was set, and the jaws were closing fast. I did not sleep. Zoe and I spent the next 8 hours tearing apart Julian's fabricated digital paper trail line by line, code by code, until the sun crept over the skyline. By 8:45 in the morning, I was walking into the towering glass and steel headquarters of Julian's firm. 50 floors up, Julian was currently standing at the head of the executive boardroom. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city, but every eye in the room was locked on the massive projector screen. The chief executive officer, Marcus Sterling, sat at the center of the mahogany table, his hands steepled in front of him. 7 other board members flanked him, looking grim. Sitting in a leather guest chair in the corner was Patricia, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, playing the role of the devastated supportive mother to absolute perfection. Julian clicked a silver remote, advancing his presentation to a slide filled with red arrows and highlighted bank statements. "It breaks my heart to stand before you today," Julian said, his voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. "But I have a fiduciary duty to this firm that supersedes my marriage. The data clearly shows that Maya abused her forensic clearance. She bypassed our security protocols and routed over $12 million from our operational accounts into her own private offshore holdings. She orchestrated the entire drug smuggling scandal to create a distraction while she drained our assets." Patricia let out a loud, dramatic sigh. "My poor son," she whispered loud enough for the entire board to hear. He trusted her implicitly, and she poisoned his life. Julian clicked to the next slide, showing a fake digital signature. "We need to vote on the emergency injunction immediately," Julian urged, pressing his hands against the table and looking earnestly at the CEO. "The press conference is scheduled for 9. We must announce federal charges against Maya before the opening bell rings. It is the only way to reassure our shareholders and stabilize the stock." I did not knock. I kicked the heavy double doors open with the flat heel of my boot. The doors slammed against the glass walls with a thunderous crack, causing Patricia to shriek and drop her silk handkerchief. I strode into the boardroom, flanked by 4 elite private security contractors I had hired at 3 in the morning. They immediately took positions at the exits, crossing their arms and staring down the room. I did not scream, I did not cry. I walked calmly past the stunned board members, past a sputtering Patricia, and stepped directly up to the podium. Julian stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. I reached out, yanked the display cable out of his laptop, and plugged it directly into my own silver laptop. "What are you doing?" Julian shouted, his face flushing a violent crimson. "You are trespassing. You have been legally suspended from this building." The projector screen flickered black and then illuminated with a complex grid of metadata, IP logs, and encrypted router histories. I turned to face my husband, resting my hands lightly on the podium. "If you are going to frame a forensic accountant, Julian," I said, my voice echoing cleanly through the massive room, "you really should not use a fake IP address that pings directly to your mother's Wi-Fi." The boardroom erupted into a chaotic murmur. Patricia jumped out of her chair, her face twisting into a mask of pure panic. "That is a lie," she screeched, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She is manipulating the data. Marcus, call building security right now and have this criminal thrown onto the street." I ignored her and tapped a key on my laptop. The screen zoomed in on a specific string of code, highlighting it in bright yellow. "You generated these fake offshore wire transfers at 11:15 last night, Julian," I explained, keeping my eyes locked on the CEO. The digital signature on these documents was forged using a keylogger software. However, you were so incredibly arrogant that you did not bother masking your hardware's unique network address. I tapped another key, and a secondary window popped up showing a floor plan of Patricia's estate. This hardware signature registers perfectly to the secondary router in the west wing of your mother's estate. You created this entire fraudulent narrative while drinking scotch in your childhood bedroom. You even logged into the estate's guest network, which Patricia conveniently named after her purebred poodle. It is a remarkably sloppy trail for a senior executive. Julian's hands balled into tight fists. He stepped toward me, his chest heaving. You planted that evidence, he spat, stepping into my personal space, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. You hacked my mother's network to make it look like I forged those documents. You are a desperate, pathetic woman grasping at straws because you know you are going to federal prison. I did not flinch. I looked at the board members who were rapidly taking notes and exchanging worried glances. He claims I transferred $12 million into a private holding account. I continued, my voice rising to command the room. But what he failed to mention is that the holding account he highlighted on his fraudulent slide does not belong to me. I hit the spacebar. The screen shifted to display the true ownership records of the account Julian had used in his fake presentation. It was not a private offshore bank. It was a domestic shell company. And listed as the primary managing director was David Julian's brother. Patricia let out a strangled gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Julian froze, all the color draining from his face, as his own brother's name flashed in 10-foot letters across the boardroom wall. Your brother has been funneling corporate funds into this shell company for 3 years to cover his massive gambling debts, I stated, delivering the facts with lethal detachment. You tried to frame me using David's account because you knew the money was already missing, and you needed a convenient scapegoat before the quarterly audit exposed your family's theft. Julian spun around wildly, pointing at my private contractors. "Get her out of here!" he screamed, his voice breaking into a frantic pitch. "She is lying. Security! I want her physically removed from this building right now. She is a hostile intruder." He grabbed the edge of my laptop, attempting to slam it shut and sever the display connection. Marcus Sterling. The CEO finally moved. He stood up from his leather chair at the center of the table. He did not yell, but his voice cut through the chaos with absolute authority. "Stop, Julian," the CEO commanded. Julian froze, his hands hovering over my keyboard. "Marcus, you cannot listen to this crazy woman." Julian pleaded, desperation bleeding into his tone. "She is trying to destroy this company." The CEO slowly lowered his hands to the table and looked directly at me, his expression unreadable. He ignored Julian's frantic protests completely. Let her speak. The trap was set and the jaws were closing fast. Julian froze, his face draining of color, as the CEO's absolute authority crushed his panic. I held Marcus's gaze for a fraction of a second before turning my attention back to my laptop. I tapped the enter key. The fabricated slides vanished, and the massive projector screen illuminated with a complex grid of authentic high-resolution banking statements, encrypted routing numbers, and unredacted federal tax filings. "Let us look at the real numbers," I announced, pacing slowly across the front of the boardroom. Julian claims I orchestrated an elaborate corporate espionage scheme to cover my own tracks. But the raw data tells a very different story. Let us systematically trace the missing $5 million of your operational capital. I dragged my cursor across the screen, highlighting a series of massive wire transfers that had been cleverly buried deep within the company's quarterly expense reports. I clicked on the origin file. The funds did not disappear into a vacuum, I explained, my voice echoing clearly through the silent room. Julian authorized these transfers under the guise of international consulting fees. But they were meticulously washed through a series of anonymous shell companies registered in Delaware. From there, the money was funneled directly into a domestic nonprofit organization, a tax-exempt charity explicitly registered for the betterment of underprivileged youth. I hit the spacebar. The screen flashed with the official state incorporation documents. The bold black letters at the top of the page read, The Patricia Foundation. A collective gasp rippled around the mahogany table. Several board members dropped their pens. Marcus Sterling narrowed his eyes, leaning forward in his leather chair to read the fine print on the screen. I turned my body away from the board and looked directly into the corner of the room where my mother-in-law was sitting. Patricia was no longer playing the role of the supportive matriarch. She was staring at the screen with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. Her heavily powdered face looked completely bloodless under the harsh fluorescent lights. The Patricia Foundation has never funded a single youth program, I stated, keeping my eyes locked on her trembling form. It has never built a playground, donated a textbook, or sponsored a scholarship. It is nothing more than a glorified washing machine for stolen corporate capital. I clicked my mouse again, bringing up a detailed itemized spreadsheet of the Foundation's expenditures. High-resolution photographs of luxury assets filled the screen. Did you really think buying a yacht in the Cayman Islands with stolen corporate funds wouldn't trigger an audit? I asked, my voice dropping to a freezing lethal register. I watched Patricia flinch violently as if I had physically struck her. The screen displayed the yacht's registration, the massive mortgage fees, and the luxury refurbishments, all paid for by the fake charity using Julian's signature. You called me a disappointment every Thanksgiving, Patricia. I continued, refusing to let her look away from me. You sat at the head of your dining table, sipping expensive wine and lecturing me about my lack of ambition. You told your elite friends I was just a glorified bookkeeper who did not deserve a place in your family. Yet you were living off the money I was hired to track. Your entire lavish lifestyle, your designer clothes, your country club memberships, and your floating palace in the Caribbean were entirely funded by corporate theft. You are not elite, Patricia. You are a parasite. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The executives who had smiled politely at Patricia just 10 minutes earlier were now staring at her with undisguised disgust. Marcus Sterling picked up his pen and tapped it once against the wood, a sharp cracking sound that made Julian jump. Is this true, Julian? Marcus asked, his voice terrifyingly calm. Did you funnel $5 million of our operational capital into a fake charity controlled by your mother? Julian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Sweat was beading on his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. He looked frantically at Patricia, begging for help, but she was too busy drowning in her own public humiliation. The board members began speaking over one another, their voices rising in anger. They demanded immediate answers. They called for security to lock down the building and confiscate Julian's corporate devices. They demanded a full, independent audit of every single account Julian had ever touched. The walls were rapidly closing in on the golden boy and his mother. Patricia realized she was completely cornered. There was no argument she could make, no lie she could spin to counteract the hard, undeniable data projected on the wall. So she resorted to the only weapon she had left in her arsenal. She went for maximum theatrical manipulation. Patricia let out a sudden piercing shriek. She grabbed her chest, her manicured fingers digging violently into the fabric of her expensive blouse. She gasped for air, her eyes rolling back in her head as she threw herself dramatically out of her leather guest chair. She hit the carpeted floor with a heavy thud, thrashing her legs and clutching her throat. I cannot breathe, she wailed, her voice echoing shrilly over the angry executives. My heart. He is giving me a heart attack. She is trying to kill me. Somebody call an ambulance. Chaos erupted instantly. Two of the junior board members jumped out of their seats, rushing over to where Patricia was thrashing on the floor. The CEO grabbed the boardroom telephone, barking orders to the receptionist to send up medical personnel. The meticulous forensic presentation I had built was suddenly sidelined by the spectacle of a wealthy woman faking a catastrophic medical emergency. I stood at the podium watching the pathetic performance with absolute disdain. I knew she was faking. Her breathing was too regular, her movements too coordinated. But the distraction was highly effective. The board's attention was completely fractured. Julian saw his opening. He realized the room was distracted by his mother's screaming, and he seized the moment with the desperation of a cornered animal. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and ripped out a folded piece of paper. He waved it wildly above his head, his face contorted with manic triumph. He stepped away from his thrashing mother and marched directly toward the center of the boardroom table, demanding that Marcus look at him. "Do not listen to her," Julian screamed, his voice cutting through the noise of the chaotic room. "It is all a lie. She manipulated those electronic files to frame us. But I have the physical proof. I have the hard copies." He slammed the piece of paper onto the mahogany wood directly in front of the CEO. "Maya signed the transfer authorizations?" Julian bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at the document. "I have her signatures right here. She authorized every single offshore wire, and now she is trying to burn my family to cover her own tracks." Marcus Sterling reached across the polished mahogany and pulled the authorization form from beneath Julian's shaking finger. The CEO adjusted his glasses and scrutinized the ink. He passed the document to the chief financial officer, who examined it just as closely. The paper made its way around the massive table, passing from one executive to the next. The silence in the glass-walled room grew heavy and oppressive. I watched their faces. I saw the exact moment the tide of the room began to turn. The outrage that had been directed at Patricia just moments ago was rapidly cooling, replaced by a cold, creeping suspicion directed entirely at me. My signature was distinct. It featured a sweeping initial letter and a sharp, aggressive loop at the end. The ink on that paper was a flawless replication. It was so perfectly executed that even I would have believed I signed it if I did not know the absolute truth. Julian saw the shift in the board member's eyes. His panicked breathing slowed. The terrified, cornered animal routine vanished, and the arrogant, entitled golden boy returned. He smoothed the lapels of his custom suit and shot me a triumphant, greasy smirk. "You can project all the colorful spreadsheets you want." Maya Julian sneered, his voice regaining its usual condescending volume. "But physical evidence does not lie. You authorized the transfer of $5 million into my brother's account to frame my family. You are a pathological liar and a criminal. Marcus, we need to call the authorities right now. She is a flight risk." Patricia suddenly found her miraculous recovery. Her fake heart attack completely forgotten, she scrambled up from the carpet and leaned heavily against the boardroom table. "Arrest her!" Patricia shrieked, her face twisted in vicious delight. "I knew she was garbage the day you brought her home, Julian. Throw this manipulative little thief in a federal holding cell where she belongs." The private security contractors behind me shifted their weight, awaiting my command, but I simply held up a single hand to keep them in place. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with my husband. I stepped away from the podium and walked slowly toward the center of the table. "It is a beautiful forgery, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly level. "I will give you that. You clearly paid top dollar for it. But that is the problem with arrogant men who think they can outsmart forensic auditors. You focus so intensely on the grand illusion that you completely ignore the foundational details." Julian scoffed, crossing his arms. "It is not a forgery. You signed it in our kitchen 3 weeks ago." I ignored him and looked directly at the chief legal counsel sitting to the right of the CEO. "Arthur, you have your laptop open," I stated. "Do me a favor. Look at the bottom left corner of that authorization form. Look at the official blue ink stamp from the notary public." Arthur frowned, adjusting his tie. He pulled the document toward him and squinted at the seal. "Yes, I see it. It is stamped and dated." "Read the registered notary identification number aloud," Arthur first instructed, "and then type that exact number into the state licensing database." Julian's smug smile faltered. His arms dropped to his sides. "What are you doing?" Julian snapped, taking a quick step toward Arthur. "That is a verified state document. You do not need to check the notary. The signature is right there." Arthur ignored Julian. He read the 6-digit identification number aloud and his fingers flew across his keyboard. The entire boardroom watched him in absolute silence. We waited for 10 agonizing seconds as the database loaded the results. Arthur leaned closer to his screen. The color rapidly drained from his face. He looked up at Julian and then turned to the CEO. "Marcus," Arthur said, his voice barely more than a dry whisper, "this notary commission expired 4 years ago." The CEO frowned deeply. Expired. Are you saying the stamp is invalid? It is worse than invalid. Marcus Arthur replied, turning his laptop around so the CEO could see the screen. The registered notary attached to this identification number is a man named Thomas Vance. According to the state registry, Thomas Vance passed away in a car accident in 2021. A shockwave tore through the boardroom. The executives stared at Julian with open horror. I stepped right up to Julian, invading his personal space. "You hired a black market document forger," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, completely merciless register. "You did not just forge my signature, Julian. You committed federal fraud by utilizing a fabricated government seal belonging to a dead man. You bought a fake stamp to legitimize your stolen millions because you knew your own legal department would flag the missing funds." "No!" Julian shouted, scrambling backward until his back hit the glass wall. "No! That is a lie. She is setting me up. She bought the fake stamp. She faked the notary to cover her own tracks so she could blame it on me. Marcus, you have to see what she is doing. She is a master manipulator." I smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile. "I anticipated you would try to deny the physical evidence, Julian. That is exactly why I did not rely solely on your staggering incompetence." I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small, encrypted digital audio recorder. I placed it gently on the polished mahogany table, right next to the forged document. "When you are running a criminal conspiracy, Julian, you really need to ensure the loyalty of your co-conspirators," I said, pressing the play button. "Especially the ones you are sleeping with." A harsh crackle of static filled the boardroom, followed by the unmistakable sound of a heavy metal door slamming shut. Then a voice echoed from the small speaker. It was a woman's voice, shaking with terror and completely broken. "I will tell you everything. Just please do not let them send me to federal prison. I will give you the ledgers. I will give you Julian." Patricia let out a horrified gasp. Julian stopped breathing entirely. His eyes bulged as he recognized the voice instantly. It was Vanessa. The recording continued, playing her tearful confession ringing out across the corporate boardroom. "Julian forced me to do it." Vanessa's recorded voice sobbed. "He brought the fake notary stamp to my apartment. He had already traced Maya's signature using a lightbox. I watched him stamp the dead man's seal onto the wire transfers. He told me if I did not route the money to his brother's shell company, he would frame me for the entire embezzlement scheme. He held my hand and forced me to process the digital approvals." I paused the recording and looked at my husband. His entire world was collapsing in real time. The arrogant golden boy facade was gone, replaced by the terrified realization that his mistress, his accomplice, his human shield had completely sold him out to the federal government. Vanessa flipped Julian. I stated the final nail driven straight into his coffin. "She gave the IRS everything. Your fake charity, your brother's shell company, and your black market forgeries. It is over." Julian stared at the audio recorder, his chest heaving, his mind completely broken by the sheer magnitude of his defeat. The silence in the boardroom was absolute and terrifying. For a man who had spent his entire life coasting on charm, manipulation, and unearned generational wealth, the sudden exposure to inescapable consequences acted like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his hip hitting the edge of the heavy mahogany table. His breath hitched in his throat as he looked around the room. He expected to see his peers. He expected to see allies. Instead, he saw a tribunal of furious executives who were realizing they had been robbed blind by the man standing in front of them. Patricia recognized the shift in the room instantly. She saw the absolute disgust radiating from Marcus Sterling and the other board members. Like a rat sensing a sinking ship, she immediately prioritized her own survival. She scrambled to her feet, smoothing the wrinkles from her designer skirt and backing away from her son. She raised her hands in a placating, desperate gesture. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured shock, "I had absolutely no idea. I am a victim here. Julian told me the foundation was a legitimate tax shelter. He lied to me. He used his own mother to facilitate this sickness. You must believe me. He acted completely alone." Julian snapped his head toward her. The sheer betrayal in his eyes was blinding. The golden boy, the devoted son, the man who had risked federal prison to fund her luxurious delusions, was now being thrown directly under the bus by the very woman who had orchestrated the entire scheme. Something dark and feral snapped inside Julian. "I acted alone!" Julian screamed, the sound tearing through the glass-walled room. He pointed a trembling manic finger directly at Patricia's face. "You are the one who demanded the money. You bled my father dry for 30 years to buy your social status. And when he died, you realized the trust was empty. You forced me to do this. You manipulated me." Patricia's eyes widened in horror. "Julian, shut your mouth," she hissed frantically, gesturing toward the board members. "No," Julian roared, stepping aggressively toward her. "I am not taking the fall for your greed. You are the mastermind. You told me to drain the corporate operational accounts. You said nobody would notice because I was a senior executive. You needed the yacht in the Caymans. You needed the diamonds. You needed the $500,000 country club memberships to pretend you were still elite. You threatened to ruin me if I did not fund your pathetic lifestyle." The pristine, wealthy family facade completely evaporated. Right in front of the most powerful executives in the city, the perfect lineage cannibalized itself in spectacular fashion. Patricia's face twisted into a mask of pure venom. She lunged forward, her hand raised high. The crack of her palm striking Julian's face echoed like a gunshot across the boardroom. The force of the slap snapped his head to the side, leaving a bright red welt across his cheek, where her heavy diamond ring had caught his skin. "You weak, pathetic little boy!" Patricia shrieked, her voice entirely stripped of its usual refined cadence. "You are completely useless. I gave you the blueprint to an empire, and you ruined it because you are too stupid to manage a simple offshore transfer. Your father was a titan, and you are nothing but a spineless disappointment. You let a cheap forensic accountant and a miserable mistress outsmart you. You disgust me." Julian stood frozen, a thin line of blood welling at the corner of his mouth. He stared at the woman he had destroyed his life to please, realizing finally that she viewed him as nothing more than a broken ATM. The board members watched the spectacle with absolute revulsion. The chief financial officer actually turned his chair away, unable to stomach the display. Marcus Sterling did not blink. The CEO stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding instant silence. The sheer gravity of his anger extinguished the screaming match between mother and son. He adjusted his suit jacket and looked at Julian with an expression of pure, icy contempt. "Julian," Marcus said, his voice echoing with lethal corporate authority, "as of this exact second, your employment at this firm is permanently terminated. You are stripped of all executive privileges, all stock options, and all severance packages." Marcus turned his cold gaze to the private security contractors standing by the doors. "Escort this man to his office," Marcus ordered. "He has exactly 5 minutes to collect his personal items before he is permanently banished from this property. If he resists, you have my full authorization to remove him by force." Julian wiped the blood from his lip with the back of his hand, his chest still heaving with erratic breaths. Furthermore, Marcus continued, looking directly between Julian and Patricia. "The legal department of this firm will cooperate entirely with the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We will hand over every document, every hard drive, and every piece of metadata Maya has provided. We will ensure that both of you face the maximum federal sentencing guidelines for racketeering and corporate fraud. And when the federal government is finished with you, this firm will sue you civilly for every single penny you stole. We will take your properties, your vehicles, and your freedom." The absolute finality of the CEO's words hung in the air. Patricia began to hyperventilate for real this time, grasping the back of a chair to keep her legs from collapsing. She was looking at total financial ruin and a lengthy stay in a federal penitentiary. But Julian did not collapse. The panic that had gripped him moments ago suddenly vanished, replaced by a chilling, hollow arrogance. He let out a low, humorless chuckle that scraped against the quiet room. He reached up and casually adjusted the knot of his custom silk tie. He smoothed the lapels of his suit jacket and rolled his shoulders completely, ignoring the threat of federal prison. "You can fire me," Marcus? Julian sneered, a dark, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. You can revoke my security badge, and you can threaten me with all the lawsuits you want, but you cannot arrest me, and neither can your federal agents. The CEO frowned, his jaw clenching. What are you talking about? Did you really think I would leave $5 million sitting in a domestic shell company? Julian asked, his eyes flashing with desperate arrogance. I knew Maya was auditing the internal logs. I knew the net was closing. So I initiated an untraceable wire transfer at 6 o'clock this morning. The money is no longer in my brother's account. It is sitting in an encrypted, heavily fortified offshore account in Dubai. It is completely untouchable by the IRS or your corporate lawyers. Julian turned toward the boardroom doors, flashing one final condescending sneer at his mother, at Marcus, and finally at me. Keep the desk, Julian said, his voice dripping with venom. I am leaving the country today. He turned on his heel to walk out. I did not let him take a second step. I moved with calculated precision, placing myself directly in his path and blocking the heavy glass boardroom doors. My elite private security contractors shifted instantly, flanking me on either side. They crossed their arms, forming an impenetrable human wall between my arrogant husband and his only escape route. You are not going anywhere, Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a low, absolute register that commanded the entire room. Get out of my way, Maya, he snarled, trying to physically push past my shoulder. I have a private charter waiting on the tarmac, and you have absolutely no legal authority to detain me. You are a suspended accountant. You are nothing. I do not need to detain you, I replied, keeping my posture completely relaxed. I just need you to turn around and look at the screen. I pulled a small wireless remote from my pocket and pressed a single button. The massive projector behind us shifted. The digital audio file of Vanessa weeping vanished. In its place, a sleek, high-security banking portal illuminated the room. The logo for the Dubai Royal Emirates Bank glowed in bright gold lettering. Below it, Julian's full legal name and his highly encrypted offshore routing numbers were displayed for every single executive in the room to analyze. Julian stopped struggling against my security team. He slowly turned around, his eyes locking onto the live feed of his supposedly untouchable safety net. Watch closely, I instructed, pressing another button on the remote. The portal refreshed. The massive sum of stolen corporate capital, the $5 million he had frantically wired at 6 o'clock this morning, appeared on the screen for a fraction of a second. Then bold red letters flashed across the portal, reading Federal Asset Seizure Protocol initiated. The numbers rapidly scrolled backward. The total plummeted in real time, ticking down by the hundreds of thousands until the final available balance settled into a stark, undeniable figure. $0.00. No. Julian whispered the word, barely escaping his throat. He stumbled toward the projector screen as if he could physically reach into the digital display and pull the money back into existence. No, that is impossible. That account is encrypted. It is a sovereign financial institution. You cannot touch that money. Nobody can touch that money. I stepped away from the doors and walked back toward the center of the boardroom table. You really should have paid more attention when I explained my job to you, Julian. You always treated my forensic accounting firm like a cute little hobby. You assumed I just balanced spreadsheets and looked at tax deductions. I leaned against the polished mahogany, folding my arms and holding his terrified gaze. I am a certified federal forensic auditor. When I uncover a Class A felony in progress, I do not just report it to a local police precinct. I trigger an immediate international asset freeze. Julian was hyperventilating now, tugging frantically at his custom silk tie, as if the fabric were choking him. But you cannot seize offshore funds, he stammered, his eyes darting wildly between the zero balance and my face. Dubai does not comply with standard corporate warrants. My lawyers assured me it was a financial fortress. They do not comply with local warrants, I corrected smoothly. But they absolutely comply with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division when presented with documented proof of international money laundering and wire fraud. I looked at Patricia, who was still slumped in her chair, clutching her chest and gasping for air as her entire world burned to ashes. Zoe sends her regards by the way I announced, projecting my voice, so Patricia would hear every single agonizing word. She utilized her Level 5 IRS security clearance and invoked the bilateral banking treaties to lock down your accounts 48 hours ago. The wire transfer you initiated this morning was not routed to your private vault, Julian. It was intercepted and deposited directly into a federal holding account. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, ensuring my words cut deep into his crumbling ego. While you were busy packing cocaine into my suitcase to frame me, I was busy packing your entire net worth into a federal lockbox. You are bankrupt. The absolute finality of his destruction finally penetrated Julian's thick skull. The money was gone, his passport was useless, his mother was completely implicated, his brother's shell company was seized, his mistress had turned state's evidence against him, and the CEO of his firm had just explicitly promised to cooperate with the federal government to ensure he received the maximum prison sentence. There was no political connection that could save him. There was no generational family trust fund left to buy his way out of consequence. He was completely and utterly trapped. The handsome, polished executive facade disintegrated. A raw, terrifying madness took over his features. The realization that he had been entirely outplayed by the woman he viewed as a disposable asset shattered his remaining sanity. His face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure, unfiltered rage, his jaw unhinging as he let out a guttural roar. "You ruined my life!" Julian screamed, a sound so feral and violent it made the board members physically recoil in their leather chairs. He did not run for the doors. He lunged directly at me. His hands formed into tight, desperate claws, aiming straight for my throat. He crossed the distance between us in a fraction of a second, his eyes wide with a blind, murderous intent. He wanted to tear me apart right there in front of the entire corporate hierarchy. I did not have time to brace myself for the impact. My private security team surged forward, boots pounding against the carpet, but Julian was already inside my personal space, his hands reaching violently for my neck. Before his fingers could even brush my collarbone, a thunderous crash violently interrupted the attack. The heavy glass boardroom doors flew open again, slamming against the walls with a deafening shatter. Julian froze inches from my throat, his hands suspended in the empty air. The sheer violence of the unexpected interruption sucked the oxygen right out of the room. A dozen heavily armed federal agents streamed into the executive boardroom. They moved with terrifying synchronized precision, fanning out across the polished mahogany floors and securing every possible exit. Their tactical boots crunched against the carpet, and the heavy black body armor they wore seemed to absorb the harsh fluorescent light of the room. Emblazoned across their chests and backs in bold yellow lettering was the acronym IRSCID, Criminal Investigation Division. Marcus Sterling and the entire board of directors scrambled backward, pressing themselves against the far glass walls to get out of the line of fire. My private security contractors immediately stepped back, lowering their hands and yielding complete jurisdiction to the federal government. Julian dropped his hands from my neck and stumbled backward. His manic feral rage instantly evaporated, replaced by the hollow, trembling realization of absolute doom. He backed into the sharp edge of the conference table, his mouth opening and closing rapidly without producing a single sound. A solitary figure stepped through the wall of federal agents. It was a woman moving with absolute calm and undeniable authority. She was not wearing standard tactical gear like the entry team. She wore a sharp, tailored black suit paired with a minimalist tactical vest. Clipped to her belt, gleaming fiercely under the boardroom lights, was a solid gold United States federal agent badge. Patricia let out a strangled, horrific gasp. She gripped the back of her leather guest chair so hard her knuckles turned completely white. Her heavily powdered face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. "Zoe?" Patricia stuttered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the syllables. "What are you doing here? What are you wearing?" Zoe stepped forward. The quiet, overlooked family member. The woman Patricia had relentlessly belittled, mocked, and dismissed for decades stood tall and completely unbothered. She unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her tactical belt. The metallic clink echoed through the dead-silent room like a ringing bell. "I am wearing the authority of the United States federal government," Patricia Zoe said, her voice echoing with lethal, absolute precision. And you are wearing a designer outfit bought entirely with laundered corporate money. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Patricia stared at her daughter-in-law, her brain completely short-circuiting as she tried to reject the reality unfolding in front of her. You are a low-level tax clerk, Patricia whispered frantically, shaking her head from side to side. You file paperwork in a cubicle. You cannot do this to me. I am your family. You are making a terrible mistake. Zoe closed the distance between them in two long, deliberate strides. She grabbed Patricia by the wrist, spinning the older woman around with practiced physical force. I am a special agent with the Criminal Investigation Division, Zoe corrected sharply, pulling Patricia's arms behind her back. And you are a federal suspect indicted on 34 counts of wire fraud, international money laundering, and tax evasion. The heavy steel cuffs snapped shut around Patricia's wrists with a harsh ratcheting sound. Patricia let out a piercing shriek of absolute humiliation as the cold metal locked into place. The wealthy, powerful executives who had once kissed her ring at elite charity galas were now actively recording her arrest on their corporate smartphones, their faces filled with disgust. Julian watched his mother get cuffed, his eyes wide and completely bloodshot. He looked from Zoe to me, finally understanding the sheer magnitude of the trap he had walked into. We had not just audited his expense reports, we had dismantled his entire existence from the inside out. You set me up, Julian screamed, pointing a shaking, sweaty finger at Zoe. You helped Maya freeze my Dubai accounts. You abused your federal clearance to steal my money. You are both going to jail for this. I did not steal anything, Julian, Zoe replied calmly, handing the sobbing Patricia off to two waiting agents. I secured stolen corporate assets under international financial treaties. Maya tracked the digital footprints, and I executed the federal seizures. You thought you were the smartest person in the room because you bullied women into submission. You never realized those same women were quietly building the gallows you are currently standing on. Julian looked around the room and realized the walls had completely closed in. His mother was weeping uncontrollably in handcuffs. His mistress was currently singing to the feds in an interrogation room. His untouchable offshore bank accounts held $0. There was no charm, no manipulation, and no lie that could save him from the heavily armed agents currently surrounding the table. Raw survival instinct overpowered whatever logic he had left. Julian spun around violently, shoving a paralyzed junior executive out of his path. He bolted toward the back of the boardroom, aiming straight for the private executive elevator. Stop right there! A senior federal agent commanded, his hand dropping instantly to his utility belt. Julian ignored the warning entirely. He sprinted frantically across the expansive room, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping wildly against the polished floor. He reached the elevator alcove and began slamming his palm against the call button, his face twisted in absolute blind panic. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes completely wild, desperately searching the room for a way out. He did not even see the two tactical agents closing in on him from his blind spot. They hit him like a freight train. The first agent tackled Julian squarely at the waist, sweeping his legs out from under him with brutal efficiency. The second agent grabbed his shoulders, driving his upper body forcefully downward. Julian hit the floor with a heavy, sickening thud. The impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs, sending a sharp gasp echoing through the alcove. He thrashed violently against the carpeted floor, kicking his legs and wildly swinging his elbows. "Get off me!" he roared, his voice cracking in sheer desperation. "I am Julian Sterling. You cannot do this to me. Do you know who my family is?" "Stop resisting," the agent barked, driving his knee directly into the center of Julian's back to pin him down. The agent grabbed a fistful of Julian's perfectly styled hair and forced his face straight into the carpet. The golden boy's cheek was crushed against the floor fibers, his manicured hands wrenched violently behind his back. The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted shut over his wrists, locking him in place. Julian stopped thrashing. He lay pinned to the floor, panting heavily, a broken, ruined man staring helplessly at the glass walls of the empire he had just lost. They hauled him up by his armpits, hauling his dead weight off the boardroom carpet. The elite corporate executive who had entered the building an hour ago, treating it like his personal kingdom, was now being dragged through the lobby in federal chains. His custom-tailored suit was wrinkled and stained, his perfectly styled hair ruined. He kept his head ducked, hiding his bruised face from the dozens of stunned employees who had crowded the glass walls to watch his spectacular public downfall. I followed quietly behind the arresting agents. Zoe walked beside me, her posture radiating a calm, intense focus. We did not say a word to each other during the ride to the federal precinct. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the synchronized silence of two women who had just detonated a nuclear bomb inside a corrupt family dynasty and were now quietly preparing to sift through the radioactive fallout. The federal holding facility was a stark contrast to the sprawling glass and mahogany boardroom. It was all cold concrete, harsh fluorescent lighting, and absolute institutional authority. I was permitted to sit in a hard plastic chair inside the observation room, staring through the heavy two-way mirror. The sound from the interrogation room filtered clearly through a small speaker mounted on the wall above my head. Julian was sitting alone at the metal table. The handcuffs had been removed and replaced with a heavy steel chain bolted directly to the floor, securing his waist and his wrists. The reality of his situation had finally stripped away the last remnants of his arrogant armor. The golden boy was weeping. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was the loud, wet sobbing of a man who had never faced a single genuine consequence in his entire 35 years of life. Two senior federal agents entered the room, taking their seats across from him. They did not bring water. They did not offer him comfort. They just opened their legal pads and stared at him with blank professional indifference. "You have to listen to me," Julian pleaded, his voice cracking as he leaned as far forward as the heavy chains would allow. "I am not the mastermind here. You saw my mother. You saw how she operates. She controlled everything. She manipulated my father until the day he died, and then she turned her sights on me. I was terrified of her. She forced me to siphon those funds to maintain her lifestyle. I was acting under extreme emotional duress. I am a victim of systematic financial abuse." The lead agent did not even blink. He clicked his pen and wrote a single line on his notepad. "Your mother is currently in the adjoining holding cell, blaming you for orchestrating the entire conspiracy, Julian. She claims you manipulated her grief to hijack the trust fund. So unfortunately, the helpless victim narrative is not going to work for either of you today." Julian wiped his nose on the sleeve of his expensive ruined jacket. His eyes darted wildly around the small gray room, frantically searching for a new angle. When the helpless son routine failed, he immediately pivoted back to the only currency he truly understood: leverage. "Look, I know how this works," Julian stammered, his voice lowering into a desperate conspiratorial whisper. "You want the big fish. My mother and I are just collateral damage. I have the client roster. I manage portfolios for billionaires, corrupt politicians, and foreign oligarchs who use our firm to wash their dirty money. I know exactly how they structure their offshore holdings and dummy corporations. Give me full immunity, and I will hand you the keys to the entire empire. I will give you everyone." I watched through the glass, feeling a surge of absolute disgust. He was willing to sell out every single person he had ever shaken hands with just to save his own skin. He had absolutely no loyalty to anyone or anything except his own survival. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room swung open before the agents could respond. Zoe walked in. She had swapped her tactical vest for a sharp black blazer, but the IRS special agent badge still gleamed prominently on her belt. She carried a massive cardboard banker box in her arms. The box was completely overflowing with thick-bound financial ledgers, printed server logs, and encrypted hard drives. She did not set the box down gently. She dropped it onto the metal table with a thunderous crash that made Julian jump in his seat. The heavy thud echoed sharply through the speaker in my observation room. "We already have your clients, Julian," Zoe announced, her voice echoing with lethal, absolute authority. Julian stared at the overflowing box, his jaw dropping open. "What is that?" "What is This is the complete forensic breakdown of your entire firm's shadow accounts, Zoe explained, leaning over the table and looking directly into his terrified eyes. Maya spent the last 48 hours tearing apart your digital infrastructure. She bypassed your firewalls, decrypted your hidden servers, and mapped every single illicit transaction your firm has processed for the past 10 years. She did not just give us your mother's fake charity, she gave us the entire network. Zoe tapped the top of the box with her index finger. We do not need your cooperation, Julian. We already have the names, the routing numbers, the tax evasion schemes, and the offshore accounts of every single billionaire you just tried to sell out. Your leverage is entirely worthless. You have absolutely nothing to trade. Julian sank back into the metal chair, the blood draining completely from his face. His chest heaved as his mind desperately tried to process the reality that I had dismantled his leverage before he even knew he needed it. He was entirely stripped of power, but narcissistic entitlement is a deeply ingrained disease. Instead of accepting defeat, Julian's panic mutated into a bizarre delusional arrogance. He looked up at the two-way mirror as if he knew exactly where I was sitting. I want to speak to my wife, Julian demanded, his voice suddenly steadying into a cold, commanding tone. Zoe crossed her arms. Your wife is a key witness in a federal fraud investigation. You do not get to dictate terms to us. Bring her in here, Julian insisted, pulling against his chains. You do not understand our dynamic. Maya is highly emotional. She is just angry because she found out about Vanessa and the money. She is lashing out, but she is my wife. We built a life together. If you just let me talk to her, I can fix this. I can convince her to drop her testimony and retract these files. I know exactly how to handle her because she still loves me. She is obsessed with me. Just put her in this room and I will make this all go away. I sat in the observation room listening to the sheer, unadulterated audacity echoing through the speaker. He actually believed he could charm his way out of a federal indictment. He actually believed I was just a hysterical, heartbroken woman waiting for his validation to make everything better. He thought he still owned me. I did not hesitate. I did not ask for permission. I stood up from the hard plastic chair, smoothed the lapels of my blazer, and walked out of the observation room. I pulled the heavy steel door open and stepped into the interrogation room, locking my eyes directly onto the man who had tried to destroy me. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me, sealing the room in absolute acoustic isolation. The metallic sound echoed off the cinder-block walls. Julian looked up from his chained wrists. His eyes, red and swollen, widened as I took the seat directly across from him. The metal table separated us, a cold stainless steel barrier, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting overhead. Zoe remained standing near the corner, folding her arms and becoming an invisible observer to the final act of this marriage. Julian stared at me, his chest heaving as he frantically recalculated his survival strategy. The feral monster who had tried to crush my windpipe an hour ago vanished. In its place, a pathetic, trembling victim materialized. "Maya, please," he whimpered, his voice cracking with manufactured vulnerability. He leaned forward, dragging the heavy steel chains across the floor. "You have to stop this. You know this is not who I really am. I am not a criminal. I am your husband." He forced a fresh wave of tears to spill over his bruised cheeks. His performance was flawless, a masterclass in emotional manipulation that he had refined over a decade. "I was drowning, Maya," he sobbed, choking on his words. "The pressure from the board, the expectations my mother forced onto me, the legacy of the firm. It was suffocating me. I made terrible mistakes, but I only did it to protect our lifestyle. To protect you." He reached his hands forward as far as the bolts in the floor would allow, his fingers grasping desperately at the empty air between us. "I lost my way," he pleaded, his voice dropping into a desperate whisper. "My mother orchestrated the offshore accounts. She manipulated my grief after my father passed, and she pushed me into the shadows. I was terrified. I was weak, but I can fix this. We can fix this." He looked at me with those wide, pleading eyes, the same eyes that had lied to me every single day for years. "Tell them to drop the federal charges, Maya. Tell Zoe we can settle this civilly. I will step down from the firm. I will go to intensive therapy. I will do whatever it takes to rebuild our marriage. We can start over. Just you and me. I love you, Maya. You know I love you. Please do not let them take my life away. I sat perfectly still, letting his pathetic soliloquy hang in the sterile air. I did not flinch. I did not cross my arms. I simply rested my hands flat on the cold steel table and looked at him. Really looked at him. I examined the expensive custom shirt, stained with boardroom carpet dirt, the manicured nails currently trembling in panic, the desperate sweat shining on his forehead. There was a time when his tears would have broken my heart. There was a time when I would have moved mountains to save him from his own mistakes. That time was long gone. I leaned forward slowly, closing the physical distance between us, until my face was only inches from his. The air in the interrogation room suddenly felt freezing cold. "Do you remember when my father died?" Julian, I asked, my voice dropping into a quiet, razor-sharp register that cut right through his sobbing. Julian blinked, the fake tears momentarily stalling. "What?" I kept my eyes locked onto his, holding him entirely captive in my gaze. "Do you remember the week of his funeral?" I continued, speaking with slow, deliberate precision. "I was completely shattered. I could barely get out of bed. And you sat next to me holding my hand, and you told me I was too emotional to handle my own inheritance. You told me the legal paperwork would simply overwhelm my fragile mental state. You convinced me to sign over total financial power of attorney to you because you wanted to protect me." Julian swallowed hard, the color draining from his face as he realized where this was going. "You transferred every single dollar of my family money into your corporate shadow accounts the very next morning." I stated the facts, hitting him like physical blows. "You thought I was too blinded by grief to notice the routing discrepancies. You thought I was just a naive little wife who did not understand forensic accounting." I leaned even closer, watching his pupils dilate in absolute terror. "That was the day I started investigating you, Julian. I did not just discover your mistress and your fraud this morning. I have been meticulously building this federal case for 3 years." Julian stopped breathing. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The realization washed over him in a horrifying slow-motion wave. Every late night I spent supposedly balancing spreadsheets, every weekend I spent locked in my home office, every single financial document I ever asked you to sign. It was all a calculated trap. I mapped your entire criminal network while smiling at you across the dinner table. I let you believe you were the smartest man in the room, while I quietly handed your encrypted hard drives over to the Criminal Investigation Division. I did not shed a single tear as I delivered the final crushing blow. "I never loved the man you became, Julian. I was just gathering evidence." The silence that followed was deafening. The fragile victim persona Julian had been desperately clinging to completely disintegrated. His ego shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. The horrific truth that he had not been betrayed by a sudden emotional outburst, but systematically hunted by his own wife for years, broke whatever remained of his sanity. He had been played. He had been completely outsmarted by the woman he had viewed as a disposable asset. A dark, violent red flushed across his neck and face. The veins in his forehead bulged against his skin. "You deceitful bitch!" Julian roared, the sound tearing from his throat like a cornered animal. He lunged upward, throwing his entire body weight against the heavy steel chains. The metal groaned and clanked loudly as he strained desperately to reach across the table and wrap his hands around my neck. When the chains held him back, denying him the physical violence he craved, his rage boiled over into pure, unfiltered venom. He reeled his head back and spat directly at my face. The warm saliva hit my cheek and jaw, a final disgusting act of a powerless man. "You are nothing," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "You hear me? You are nothing without me." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or react to his feral screaming. I simply reached into the pocket of my blazer, pulled out a pristine white handkerchief, and calmly wiped my face. I folded the fabric carefully, placed it back into my pocket, and stood up from the metal table. I smoothed the wrinkles from my suit, looking down at the raving lunatic chained to the floor. I turned my back to him and looked at Zoe, who was already stepping forward to secure the prisoner. "I am done here," I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of emotion. "Throw away the key." I stepped out of the interrogation room, leaving the heavy steel door to click shut behind me. The sterile federal hallway was quiet, a sharp contrast to Julian's muffled sobbing. But the peace did not last long. From the holding cell at the far end of the corridor, a shrill, piercing voice echoed off the cinderblock walls. Patricia was awake and she was furious. "I am a senior board member of the Oak Ridge Country Club." Patricia shrieked, her voice vibrating with hysterical entitlement. "You cannot hold me in this concrete dungeon. My custom-tailored Chanel suit is getting completely ruined against this filthy metal bench. This is a direct violation of my human rights, and I demand to speak to my attorney immediately." I walked slowly down the corridor, stopping just out of her direct line of sight near the observation glass. Inside the cell, Patricia was pacing the small enclosed space like a caged animal. She gripped the heavy steel bars, violently shaking them. Her heavily sprayed hair had collapsed on one side, and her immaculate makeup was smearing, creating dark, jagged circles under her eyes. A stoic federal guard stood outside her cell, completely ignoring her demands, his arms crossed over his tactical vest. "Call William Sterling," Patricia ordered, pointing a manicured finger through the bars. "He is a senior partner at the most prestigious firm in the city. When he hears how I have been treated, you will all lose your pensions. I want the regional director of this facility down here right now." The heavy security doors at the end of the corridor buzzed loudly and clicked open. Heavy footsteps echoed against the linoleum floor. It was David. Julian's older brother had always been the quiet one. He was the son who chose a modest life as an architect over the cutthroat corporate world his mother relentlessly worshipped. He walked down the hall with heavy shoulders, his face pale and completely devoid of expression. He held a thick manila folder gripped tightly in his right hand. Patricia spotted him instantly. She rushed to the front of the cell, pressing her face against the steel bars. Her expression shifted from manic rage to desperate, frantic relief. "David," she gasped, her voice cracking. "Oh, thank God you are here. Tell these absolute lunatics who we are. Pay whatever extortionate bail they are demanding and get me out of this filthy cage. Julian is somewhere in this building being harassed by that wretched wife of his. We need to hire a crisis management team immediately and sue this entire department." David did not reach for his wallet. He did not demand answers from the guard. He simply stood there staring through the metal bars at the woman who had birthed him. He looked at her, not with the familiar deference of a dutiful son, but with the cold, hollow stare of a man examining a complete stranger. "I am not here to bail you out," Mother David said. His voice was terrifyingly calm, lacking any of his usual nervous hesitation. Patricia froze. Her manicured fingers loosened their grip on the bars. Her eyes darted from his exhausted face, down to the thick folder in his hands. "What are you talking about, David?" she stammered, her tone dropping its hysterical edge and taking on a sharp, defensive whine. "This is a massive misunderstanding. Maya and Zoe orchestrated some ridiculous conspiracy to steal our assets. We need to fight this together." David stepped closer to the cell. He lifted the manila folder and pressed the flat side of it directly against the steel bars. "Maya and Zoe did not steal anything," David replied, his voice absolute and unwavering. "They gave me this folder 20 minutes ago. They gave me the complete, unredacted accounting of my personal trust fund. The one grandfather left entirely in my name. The one you and Julian insisted on managing for me because you claimed I did not have the financial literacy to handle complex investments." Patricia physically recoiled. She took a staggering step backward into the center of the holding cell. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin a pale, sickly gray. David opened the folder. He pulled out a stack of bank statements, highlighted with bright yellow marker, holding them up to the harsh fluorescent light. "I spent the last hour looking at 30 years of systematic theft." He continued reading the numbers aloud as if reciting a eulogy. "You and Julian have been bleeding my accounts dry since the day I turned 18. You used my money to cover Julian's margin calls. You used my money to buy your summer home in the Hamptons. You used my money to fund the offshore accounts Maya just seized. David, you have to understand, Patricia interrupted, her voice pitching upward in a desperate, frantic plea. It was a temporary relocation of family assets. We hit a rough patch when Julian expanded the firm. We were going to replenish the accounts. You are family. We all share the financial burden. There is no burden to share, David said, his voice rising in volume, echoing sharply down the concrete hall. There is nothing left. You drained every single cent. I have 2 children heading to college next year, and their tuition funds are completely gone. You did not just steal my inheritance, Mother. You stole your grandchildren's future to buy yourself designer clothes and fund your golden child's criminal empire. I am bankrupt. I am your mother, Patricia cried out, stepping back toward the bars and reaching her hand out through the gaps. You cannot turn your back on me. I gave you everything. You gave me nothing, David corrected, stepping back so her hand grasped only empty air. You gave Julian everything. You just used my name to pay for it. David shook his head slowly, a profound look of absolute finality settling over his features. He closed the manila folder and tucked it under his arm. I am filing criminal charges against you tomorrow morning, David announced, the finality of his words echoing like a gavel striking wood. I will be testifying alongside Maya and Zoe. You are dead to me. Do not ever contact me or my family again. David. Patricia screamed, her voice tearing through the sterile air. You cannot leave me here. David, come back. David turned his back on the holding cell and walked down the corridor. He did not stop. He did not hesitate. The heavy security doors buzzed open and clicked shut behind him, swallowing him into the outside world. I stepped out from the shadows of the observation glass and walked slowly toward the cell. Patricia was slumped against the cold concrete wall. She slid down the painted cinder blocks until she hit the metal floor. The immaculate country club matriarch was entirely gone. Her designer clothes were heavily wrinkled and stained with precinct dirt. Her hair was a tangled, ruined mess. She sat on the floor of the federal holding facility, completely isolated. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and hollow. The reality of her existence finally crashed over her in a suffocating wave. Her obsession with status, her relentless greed, and her toxic manipulation had cost her everything. Her golden child was heading to federal prison. Her quiet child had completely disowned her. Her wealth was seized. Her social standing was obliterated. She was entirely alone, trapped in a cold cell, with absolutely no one left to manipulate. 4 months later, that same crushing reality descended upon her accomplice. The federal courthouse in downtown Manhattan was a fortress of polished oak and absolute authority. I sat quietly in the second row of the spectator gallery, my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I wore a tailored charcoal suit projecting the calm, impenetrable professionalism of a woman who had already won the war. At the defense table stood Vanessa. The physical transformation was staggering. The woman who had once pranced through my house in designer silk, drinking my expensive wine and sleeping with my husband, was completely unrecognizable. She wore an oversized, faded orange corrections jumpsuit. Her expensive blonde extensions had grown out into jagged dark roots, and her perpetually tanned skin had faded into a sickly institutional gray. Her hands were shackled heavily at the waist, restricting her movements to stiff, awkward shuffling. She was weeping, her shoulders shaking violently as she stood before the towering bench of the federal judge. Your Honor. I was manipulated, Vanessa sobbed, her voice echoing off the high vaulted ceiling. Julian controlled everything. I was terrified of him. I did not understand the magnitude of the financial structures I was signing off on. I was just doing what I was told to survive. He pressured me into everything. I was just a pawn in his game. The federal judge, a stern man with zero tolerance for crocodile tears, adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the sprawling file in front of him. It was the exact file Zoe and I had meticulously assembled. Miss Vance, the judge began, his voice booming through the microphone. You expect this court to believe you were a helpless victim in this conspiracy. Yet the forensic evidence provided to the FBI paints a remarkably different picture. We have verified digital logs showing you actively routing stolen funds through offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. We have records of your extravagant personal spending using laundered corporate accounts. More disturbingly, we have the physical evidence of the narcotics. Vanessa flinched violently at the mention of the drugs. You actively procured a substantial quantity of cocaine. The judge continued, his tone laced with absolute disgust. You then conspired to plant those narcotics inside the personal luggage of an innocent woman. You fully intended to have Julian's wife arrested at an international border checkpoint and subjected to decades in a foreign prison. Your fingerprints were recovered directly from the plastic wrapping by federal agents. That is not the behavior of a frightened victim. That is the calculated malice of a willing co-conspirator. Vanessa swayed on her feet, gripping the edge of the defense table to keep from collapsing. Her defense attorney placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, looking thoroughly defeated. However, the judge sighed, turning the page. The prosecution has submitted a motion for leniency based on your subsequent cooperation. You provided the necessary access codes to the remaining encrypted hard drives, and you agreed to wear a wire during your final interactions with Julian Sterling, securing key audio confessions. Because of this substantial assistance to the federal government, I am deviating from the maximum sentencing guidelines. The courtroom held its collective breath. Vanessa Vance. I sentence you to 10 years in a federal penitentiary followed by 5 years of supervised release. You are remanded immediately to the custody of the Bureau of Prisons, 10 years. Vanessa let out a guttural, devastating wail. Her knees buckled, and her defense attorney had to catch her by the elbow to keep her from hitting the floor. 10 years in federal lockup. Her youth, her beauty, her glamorous lifestyle completely stripped away in the blink of an eye. All the stolen wealth in the world could not buy back a single second of the decade she was about to lose. The bailiff stepped forward immediately, grabbing her by the arms and turning her away from the bench. As they marched her down the center aisle toward the holding area, her tear-streaked face frantically scanned the gallery. Her eyes locked onto mine. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked at her with the cold, clinical detachment of an auditor closing out a finished ledger. The realization that I was sitting there freely watching her final moments of freedom shattered whatever restraint she had left. "You ruined my life," Vanessa screamed, her voice cracking as she thrashed against the heavy grip of the federal bailiffs. "You set me up. You took everything from me." The bailiffs yanked her forward, but she dug her heels into the carpet, refusing to break eye contact with me. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my charcoal blazer. I stepped out of the wooden pew and moved to the edge of the aisle, placing myself just inches away from her frantic, struggling form. I kept my voice incredibly low, so only she could hear the absolute finality of my words. "You packed your own bags, Vanessa," I said, my tone perfectly level and chillingly calm. "I just made sure they went to the right destination." Vanessa gasped as if all the oxygen had been punched out of her lungs. The fight completely drained from her body. The bailiffs jerked her forward, pulling her through the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. The doors swung shut with a heavy thud, severing her from the outside world for the next decade. I took a deep breath of the cool, air-conditioned air, feeling an immense weight lift from my shoulders. One piece of the toxic puzzle had been permanently eradicated, but the main event was still waiting. 6 weeks later, the media circus descended upon the financial district. The trial of Julian Sterling was branded by the financial press as the corporate takedown of the decade. News vans lined the streets, blockading the courthouse steps. Reporters shouted over one another, desperate for a soundbite about the spectacular implosion of the Sterling family empire. The sheer scale of the fraud, the international money laundering, and the dramatic family betrayal had turned the proceedings into a national spectacle. Every major network had cameras positioned outside, waiting for the golden boy to face justice. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with executives, journalists, and former clients. Julian sat at the defense table, looking like a hollowed-out shell of his former self. His bespoke Italian suits had been replaced by a drab, oversized prison uniform. He was staring blankly at the mahogany table, his hands trembling slightly as he awaited his executioner. The lead federal prosecutor stood up from her desk, adjusting her microphone. The entire room fell into an absolute pin-drop silence. The prosecution calls our lead expert forensic witness to the stand, the prosecutor announced, her voice ringing clear and authoritative. We call Maya Sterling. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The flash of dozens of press cameras illuminated the hallway behind me like a strobe light. I walked down the center aisle carrying a single heavy leather briefcase. I did not look at the jury. I did not look at the breathless reporters packing the gallery. I walked past the wooden gate and stepped directly into the witness box. Julian slowly raised his head. Our eyes met across the crowded courtroom. The terror radiating from his face was absolute. He knew he was not just facing a scorned wife looking for petty revenge. He was facing the architect of his total destruction. I raised my right hand to swear the oath, ready to bury him under the mountain of evidence I had spent years building in the dark. I lowered my hand and took my seat in the polished oak witness box. The prosecution had spent the morning walking me through the foundational evidence, but the real battle was waiting for the cross-examination. Julian's lead defense attorney stood up from his table and buttoned his custom suit jacket. He was an older man in his late 50s with silver hair and a practiced, condescending smile. He approached the podium with the easy arrogance of a man who made his living bullying witnesses into submission. Mrs. Sterling, he began, intentionally emphasizing my marital title. Or do you prefer Miss Maya? I want to make sure I am addressing you correctly before we delve into this rather extraordinary narrative you have presented today. Maya is fine, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. Very well, Maya. The attorney smiled, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. You have spun quite a tale for us. According to your testimony, you single-handedly dismantled a sophisticated international financial network. You, a 30-year-old woman with a basic accounting degree, claim to have bypassed corporate firewalls and decrypted offshore routing protocols that managed to elude federal regulators for a decade. He paused, letting his skepticism hang heavily in the air. He turned to the jury, shaking his head in mock amusement. Let us be honest with ourselves, Maya. You are currently going through a highly contentious divorce. You discovered your husband was having an affair. You were angry. You were hurt. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, as the old saying goes. Is it not true that this entire forensic investigation is simply the vindictive fabrication of a bitter, jealous wife seeking to completely destroy the man who broke her heart? I looked at him and felt a deep, satisfying calm wash over me. He had walked exactly into the trap I had laid for him. He was relying on the oldest, most predictable, misogynistic playbook in legal history. He wanted to paint me as an emotional, hysterical woman who could not possibly understand complex finance. I leaned slightly forward into the microphone. If you are asking whether I was angry about the infidelity, the answer is yes, I stated, my voice echoing crystal clear through the courtroom speakers. But anger does not generate 50,000 pages of immutable financial data, counselor. Jealousy does not fabricate hidden routing numbers. And a broken heart does not wire $3.2 million into a Cayman Islands shell company. The defense attorney frowned, attempting to interrupt. Now see here. I did not let him finish. I smoothly overrode his voice, projecting absolute, undeniable authority. Let us look at Exhibit D14. I continued, directing my gaze to the jury, who were already leaning forward in their seats. On October 12th of last year, my husband executed a wire transfer using the SWIFT protocol through a subsidiary account masked under his mother's charity. The routing number ended in 4472. According to IRS Tax Code Section Subpart F, which governs controlled foreign corporations, that transfer was legally required to be reported as taxable income. It was not. The attorney gripped the edges of his podium. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is offering legal conclusions. The judge waved him off. The witness was called as a forensic financial expert counselor. Overruled. Proceed, Maya. I turned back to the defense attorney who was beginning to sweat under the collar of his expensive suit. Instead of reporting the income, Julian routed those funds through 3 separate offshore dummy corporations located in Belize before dropping them into a central holding account. I explained the numbers and codes flowing from my memory with lethal precision. From there, he used the capital to cover his massive margin calls on failing real estate investments. But he was still running a severe deficit. He needed a massive influx of cash, and he needed it instantly. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the press gallery had stopped typing, captivated by the complete dismantling of Julian's defense. "This brings us to the events of my arrest at the airport," I said, my voice dropping to a chillingly calm register. "You characterized the narcotics planted in my luggage as a clumsy attempt to simply remove a troublesome wife. That is entirely incorrect. Julian and Vanessa did not just want me in prison. They needed a public scandal." The defense attorney swallowed hard, looking back at Julian, who had gone the color of ash. "My name was listed as the primary shareholder on our firm's most lucrative subsidiary," I explained, locking eyes with the jury. Julian knew that if I was arrested at an international border checkpoint for narcotics trafficking, the subsidiary's stock would immediately plummet. It was a calculated, engineered PR crisis. Julian had already taken out a massive short sell position against that exact stock. He was betting against his own company. He planted the drugs to trigger the crash so he could cash out the short sell and cover his embezzled losses before the board of directors noticed the missing funds. I stared directly at the defense attorney. My voice was a blade slicing through the last remaining shreds of his condescending arrogance. "I am not a bitter wife seeking petty revenge," I stated, the absolute truth ringing off the mahogany walls. "I am the forensic auditor who caught your client committing federal securities fraud, wire fraud, and tax evasion. The math is not emotional, counselor. The math is absolute." The defense attorney stood frozen at his podium. He opened his mouth to speak, but his mind was completely blank. His entire strategy had hinged on discrediting me as a hysterical woman. He had absolutely no counter-arguments for the intricate web of undeniable tax codes, routing numbers, and digital footprints I had just laid out before the federal court. He looked down at his legal pad, then up at the judge. The silver-haired bulldog of the defense bar was entirely speechless. "No further questions," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He turned around and walked back to the defense table, slumping into his chair like a defeated man. The judge nodded, thanking me for my testimony, and formally handed the case over to the jury for deliberation. As the bailiffs moved to secure the courtroom, I stood up from the witness box. I looked across the room. Julian was staring at me. The arrogant entitlement, the golden boy charm, the narcissistic delusion was all completely eradicated. He was gripping the edge of the defense table, his knuckles white, his chest heaving. As the reality of his impending multi-decade prison sentence finally crashed down upon him, Julian Sterling looked at me with pure absolute terror. The jury did not even require a full afternoon to process the mountain of forensic evidence. I had barely finished my coffee in the courthouse cafeteria with Zoe when the bailiff announced that a verdict had been reached. 1 hour and 47 minutes. In the realm of complex federal white-collar crime, a deliberation that brief was completely unheard of. It meant there was absolutely no debate. There was no confusion. The 12 men and women sitting in that room had looked at the pristine, indisputable math and saw Julian Sterling for exactly what he was. The atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted from tense anticipation to suffocating dread as the gallery scrambled back into their seats. Julian was sweating profusely, the expensive fabric of his prison-issued suit clinging awkwardly to his shrinking frame. His lead defense attorney refused to look at him, staring resolutely at the blank legal pad on the table. They both knew what a rapid verdict meant. A fast return is never a victory for the defense. The heavy wooden doors adjacent to the bench swung open, and the jury filed back into the box. None of them looked in Julian's direction. Their eyes were fixed straight ahead or directed down at the floor. The federal judge struck his gavel, demanding absolute silence. He turned to the jury foreperson, a middle-aged schoolteacher who held the sealed envelope with a steady hand. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. "We have your honor," she replied. The court clerk retrieved the envelope, handing it up to the bench. The judge opened it, his expression remaining completely stoic as his eyes scanned the paperwork. He handed it back to the clerk. "Julian Sterling, please rise," the clerk instructed. Julian struggled to stand. His legs trembled so violently that he had to brace his hands flat against the mahogany table to keep himself upright. He looked like a cornered animal, completely stripped of his golden boy armor. "On count 1 of federal wire fraud, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty." The foreperson read, her voice ringing clear. Julian flinched as if he had been physically struck. "On count 2 of federal tax evasion, guilty. On count 3, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, guilty." The word became a rhythmic, lethal drumbeat. 14 separate times the foreperson read the charges. 14 separate times the word guilty echoed off the polished wood paneling. Julian was found culpable for every single hidden routing number, every offshore shell corporation, every falsified tax return, and finally, the most damning charge of all: conspiracy to distribute and traffic narcotics. The final guilty verdict sucked the remaining air directly out of Julian's lungs. The murmurs in the gallery erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps and frantic whispering from the press corps. The judge slammed his gavel down 3 times, silencing the room instantly. "Given the overwhelming weight of the evidence and the defendant's clear flight risk, I am proceeding straight to sentencing," the judge announced, glaring down at the defense table. "Julian Sterling, your actions represent the absolute worst kind of corporate greed and sociopathic entitlement. You weaponized your privilege, you stole from your own family, and you actively conspired to destroy an innocent woman's life, using federal borders as a tool for your petty vengeance. There is no remorse in your actions today. There is only regret that you were outsmarted." The judge adjusted his glasses, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly cold register. "Julian Sterling, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison. This sentence is to be served consecutively without the possibility of parole." Julian's knees instantly gave out. The sheer gravity of 25 years, a quarter of a century locked inside a concrete cage, completely broke him. He collapsed, dropping straight down to the floor. The heavy thud of his knees hitting the carpet echoed sharply. He grabbed the edge of the table, dragging his fingernails across the polished wood as he fell. 2 federal marshals immediately lunged forward, grabbing him under the armpits and hauling his dead weight back to his feet. He was openly weeping now, the loud, wet sobbing of a man who realized his life was entirely over. He would lose his youth, his wealth, his status, and his freedom. He would turn 60 years old inside a federal penitentiary. The judge did not pause to let the reality settle. He turned a page in his ledger. Furthermore, as a co-conspirator and active participant in the offshore fraud network, Patricia Sterling is hereby sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, the judge declared. From the holding cell corridor, a muffled shriek could be heard, followed by the sound of scuffling boots. Patricia's reign of terror was officially terminated. Her country club memberships and designer handbags replaced by a decade and a half of institutional gray. Julian hung suspended between the 2 federal marshals, his feet barely touching the floor. His head rolled back, and his tear-filled eyes found me sitting calmly in the second row of the gallery. The arrogance was completely eradicated. The manipulative charm was entirely gone. He looked at me with the desperate, pathetic pleading of a drowning man. He was begging me, silently begging me to save him, to rewind the clock, to fix the mess he had created. He wanted his obedient, naive wife back. I sat perfectly still. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I looked at the man who had tried to steal my inheritance, gaslight me, and lock me in a foreign prison. I offered him a single polite nod of acknowledgement, a cold, simple gesture confirming that the transaction was complete. Then I stood up, turned my back to him forever, and walked out of the courtroom. The heavy double doors of the courthouse opened up to a blinding sea of flashing camera lights. The crisp afternoon air washed over me, erasing the stale institutional smell of the courtroom. Dozens of reporters swarmed the stone steps, shoving microphones and digital recorders toward my face. Zoe flanked my right side wearing a sharp smile, while her federal agents created a secure perimeter around us, guiding us down the wide marble staircase. Maya, Maya, one reporter shouted over the chaotic din. Your husband was just sentenced to 25 years. You single-handedly dismantled a multi-million-dollar criminal empire. How do you feel right now? Was this about getting revenge for the affair? I stopped on the bottom step. The sea of journalists instantly fell quiet, hanging on my every movement. I looked out at the flashing lenses, the eager faces, the rolling cameras recording this moment for national television. I thought about the years of quiet, meticulous work, the late nights decrypting servers, the endless gaslighting I endured while gathering my evidence. I stepped up to the closest cluster of microphones. My voice was steady, authoritative, and completely devoid of bitterness. This was never about revenge. I stated the words ringing with absolute clarity. Revenge is an emotional reaction. What you saw today was entirely mathematical. Julian Sterling created a deficit. He stole from his clients, his family, and his wife. I simply audited the accounts. I looked directly into the central camera lens, offering a faint, razor-sharp smile. Justice is just a matter of balancing the ledger. I turned and walked toward the waiting town car, leaving the Sterling dynasty buried in the ashes of their own greed. Exactly 1 year later, the view from the 42nd floor of my Manhattan office building offered an uninterrupted panorama of the city. The floor-to-ceiling glass was pristine, catching the brilliant morning sunlight and casting long, sharp shadows across my massive marble desk. The name embossed in bold platinum lettering on the frosted glass doors at the reception area read, Vance & Associates Elite Forensic Auditing. I had taken back my maiden name and built an absolute empire on top of it. I was no longer the quiet, obedient wife hiding in the shadows of a fraudulent corporate dynasty. I was the apex predator of the financial district. Fortune 500 companies hired my firm to audit their internal structures before federal regulators could even knock on their doors. Top-tier law firms retained my services at exorbitant hourly rates to untangle complex offshore laundering webs. I was universally respected, incredibly wealthy, and for the first time in my entire life, entirely independent. The crushing weight of Julian's manipulations was nothing more than a distant memory, replaced by the hum of genuine, well-earned success. The heavy glass door to my private executive suite swung open effortlessly. Zoe stepped inside, breaking the quiet morning atmosphere. She was wearing a tailored navy blue pantsuit that projected absolute, undeniable authority. Pinned to her belt was her federal badge, which now bore a significantly heavier title. She was the newly appointed director of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. We had both leveled up. The two women who had quietly brought down a multi-million-dollar syndicate were now running their respective worlds. Zoe smiled warmly, kicking the door shut behind her with her heel. She was carrying 2 large cups of artisan coffee from the ridiculously expensive roastery down the block. I come bearing gifts, she announced, setting the steaming cups down on the pristine surface of my desk. And I am not just talking about the caffeine, Maya. Though this dark roast is exactly what we need to celebrate. I stepped away from the window, smoothing the front of my designer pencil skirt. I took my seat in the high-backed leather executive chair and accepted the coffee. The rich aroma filled the space, grounding me in the reality of this beautiful new life. Celebrate what exactly? I asked, taking a slow sip. My schedule is packed today, Zoe. I have a preliminary audit review for a tech conglomerate at noon and a board meeting at 3. Zoe chuckled, pulling up a sleek guest chair and crossing her legs. You can clear 5 minutes for this, she insisted, leaning forward with a gleam of absolute triumph in her eyes. I just received the official Bureau of Prisons update through the federal database. I thought you would want to hear the latest news regarding our favorite former socialite. I raised an eyebrow, gesturing for her to continue. Patricia Sterling is officially settling into her new long-term career, Zoe said, her smile widening. The woman who used to host high society charity galas, who drank $1,000 champagne and constantly belittled your wardrobe choices, has been permanently assigned to the prison laundry room. She spends 12 hours a day folding scratchy institutional orange jumpsuits and washing bed linens for her fellow inmates. She tried to petition the warden for an administrative desk job, claiming she had sensitive skin, but her request was entirely ignored. A quiet sense of profound justice settled over me. Patricia had spent her entire existence looking down on people who worked for a living, treating the working class like invisible servants. Now she was doing manual labor for 50 cents an hour, surrounded by concrete walls. She would spend the next 15 years exactly where she belonged. "And Julian," I asked, my voice perfectly level, betraying no emotion. Zoe leaned back in her chair, taking a long sip of her coffee before delivering the final finishing blow. "Julian is done, Maya. Completely and utterly finished. His high-priced appellate lawyers tried to file a desperate motion for a mistrial last week. They claimed the jury was biased and that your forensic evidence was improperly admitted. The federal appellate judge threw the motion out yesterday afternoon without even granting them a formal hearing. The ruling stated that the mathematical evidence you provided was irrefutable and absolute. Julian was denied his appeal. He has exhausted every single legal loophole available to him. He is stuck in that maximum security cell for the full 25 years. He will be an old, forgotten man by the time he ever sees the outside of a fence." The news washed over me, finalizing the absolute end of the Sterling legacy. There were no more moves for them to make. There were no more hidden accounts to drain. The toxic puzzle had been completely dismantled, and the pieces were permanently locked away. Julian had thought he was a mastermind playing a game of international chess, but he had fundamentally failed to realize that I was the one controlling the board. I placed my coffee cup down on a customized leather coaster. I reached out and tapped the spacebar on my keyboard, waking up my dual monitors. The screens flared to life, illuminating my face with the soft blue glow of endless spreadsheets, complex algorithms, and encrypted routing numbers. It was a new case, a massive corporate embezzlement scandal waiting to be unraveled by my hands. I looked at the data streaming across the screen and felt a deep, powerful sense of peace. I had turned my greatest vulnerability into my ultimate weapon. I had taken the very skills Julian had used to exploit me and weaponized them to secure my freedom. "You know, Zoe," I said, my voice low and steady. I leaned back into the soft leather of my executive chair, locking eyes with my closest ally. "Julian always told me that my obsession with numbers would drive people away." I smiled, feeling the absolute certainty of my victory resonating in every single syllable. "But it turns out the right numbers just drove the trash out." Zoe laughed, a bright, victorious sound that echoed beautifully off the high glass walls of my Manhattan office. She raised her coffee cup, extending it across the marble desk. I picked up my cup and met her halfway. The ceramic clinked together in a perfect final toast to our independence, our success, and our untouchable future. I turned back to my screens, ready to conquer the world all over again. The ultimate lesson from Maya's journey is that genuine empowerment stems from meticulous preparation rather than emotional reaction. When faced with devastating betrayal, it is incredibly easy to let raw anger dictate our actions. However, Maya demonstrates that true justice relies on undeniable facts, absolute patience, and quiet competence. By transforming her profound grief into a calculated strategy, she entirely reclaimed her narrative and systematically dismantled a toxic empire. Her story is a powerful reminder that our deepest vulnerabilities can be forged into our most formidable weapons. Share a time you turned a massive setback into a personal triumph in the comments below.